Dutch van der Linde's story does not begin on that cliff. Yet the image lingers, an aging outlaw framed against a cold sky in Red Dead Redemption, coat whipping in the wind, gun in hand, nowhere left to run. One last speech, one last stand, and a single step into the void. That final, doomed silhouette is the destination. The journey is a mind-breaking, inch by inch, over decades. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to that lonely fall in the early 1900s, the van der Linde gang is more than a band of criminals. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family built in defiance of a world that had no place for them. Dutch once stood as the living embodiment of frontier idealism, a man who believed that freedom could be carved out of the wilderness with a revolver in one hand and a book of philosophy in the other. Around him gathered lost souls and strays, misfits and runaways, drawn to an idea as much as to a man. This was, in the truest sense, a found family. Arthur the devoted son, John the rebellious heir, Hosea the steady partner who knew when to run instead of fight. Their campfires were not just mission hubs. They were a utopian experiment in the shadows of civilization, a fragile attempt to live outside the reach of railroads, banks, and government badges. Yet the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. The same America that promised endless horizons was being strangled by iron rails, factory smoke, and the quiet march of lawmen with typewriters and telegraphs. In that pressure, Dutch's philosophy began to twist. Freedom turned into flight, caution turned into cruelty, loyalty curdled into suspicion, and then into outright betrayal. Was this a noble cause under siege, or the slow unmasking of a man who had always been running from himself? This is where the lens narrows. Dutch does not shatter overnight. Rockstar lets the cracks spread almost frame by frame. A campfire speech that leans a little too hard on destiny. A tiny animation where his eyes glaze past the people he calls family. A throwaway line about one last score that sounds less convincing each time. A journal entry that repeats the same justifications until they ring hollow. Each detail becomes a piece of psychological evidence in a long, tragic case study. Across this saga stand the contrasts that define the fall. Dutch the philosopher versus Dutch the hypocrite, preaching freedom while tightening his grip. Arthur the believer, clinging to the dream, against John the skeptic, already half pulled toward another life. Hosea's weary pragmatism set against Micah's grinning chaos, one urging retreat while the other whispers escalation. The gang's dream of open skies pressed relentlessly against the iron certainty of progress. On that cliff, all of these tensions finally converge. To understand how Dutch reaches that edge, the story must begin long before the drop. To trace that path, this will tell the entire lore of the van der Linde gang as it orbits Dutch's unraveling mind. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to those final bullets on the cliffs of Red Dead Redemption. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family built on a philosophy that cannot survive the world closing in. The scope is absolute. From the first awkward encounter between Dutch and Hosea, two conmen trying to rob each other on a muddy road, to the moment John Marston faces the living embodiment of everything Dutch once preached, every major chapter is here. The early robberies dressed up as rebellion, the growing camp that becomes a wandering civilization of outlaws, the last stand against a world that insists the old ways were dying. The structure follows time itself. The narrative begins at the very beginning, when Dutch and Hosea discover in each other not just a partner in crime, but a shared, idealistic hunger for freedom. It moves through the adoption of Arthur and then John, through expansion and feuds, through Blackwater and Guarma and Beaver Hollow, all the way to Dutch's isolated, haunted years in the first Red Dead Redemption. At each step, the story pauses, slows, and zooms in. This is not merely a recap of robberies and shootouts. It is, in the truest sense, a psychological and thematic autopsy. When does Dutch stop being a flawed idealist and start sounding more like a cult leader? When does that cult leader harden into a nihilist who will let a man die in the mud just to protect his own myth? The answers live in tiny details. A glance held too long, a tremor in the voice, a hand that no longer trembles before pulling the trigger. Specific scenes become case studies. Dutch sparing hostages on the early train jobs contrasts with his cold execution of Angelo Bronte. His rhetorical flourishes about freedom and family at Horseshoe Overlook echo bitterly against the paranoid pacing and glassy stares of Beaver Hollow. The Blackwater ferry job, never fully shown, hangs over every "I have a plan," turning that once inspiring promise into a warning siren. The depth reaches into every major fault line. Hosea's weary pragmatism and quiet doubts, Arthur's journals and growing moral clarity, John's pull toward Abigail and civilization, each becomes a mirror that shows another crack in Dutch's mind. The Blackwater trauma, Guarma's fever dream of revolution, the manipulation of native tribes as disposable tools in his private war against progress, all chart the slide from philosophy to obsession. Despite all the gunfights and grand speeches, the true beginning of this saga is not a massacre or a bank vault blown open, but a botched roadside robbery that collapses into laughter and a lifelong partnership. That small, almost comic moment is where the dream starts. The next step is to watch how that dream grows. The story of Dutch and Hosea begins on a dusty roadside and in a moment of pure, almost ridiculous symmetry. Two wagons, one carrying a traveling merchant, the other a nervous family, roll to a stop in the late afternoon light. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but out here, there was still room for an outlaw with a plan. Or in this case, for two. Dutch van der Linde steps out first, young, sharp-eyed, coat a little too fine for the wilderness. He speaks with that easy confidence that will one day command a campfire and a battlefield, promising the merchant that cooperation will mean freedom from harm. At the same time, from the other side of the road, Hosea Matthews emerges with his own rehearsed charm, already halfway through a con about fake bonds and guaranteed returns. Each man believes he is the smartest soul in the clearing. Each is about to be proven wrong. What begins as a robbery turns almost instantly into a standoff of wits. Dutch interrupts Hosea's patter. Hosea coolly points out that Dutch's revolver is pointed at the same purse he has already claimed. The merchant trembles, the family prays, and for a breath it seems blood will decide the matter. Yet instead of gunfire, there is a pause, a glance, and then laughter. Genuine, surprised, uncontrollable laughter. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is born not from slaughter, but from two men realizing they have met their match. In that laughter, early Dutch reveals himself. He is charismatic and well-read, quoting half-remembered philosophy and railing against government bonds and railroad tycoons, turning a simple hold-up into a speech about civilization choking the life out of honest people. He talks of freedom, of family, of a roaming community that takes only from those who have already bought the law. Even here, at the very beginning, there is a hint of ego wrapped in idealism, a man convinced that his dreams justify his crimes. Hosea, older and more cautious, hears the music but also the danger. A seasoned conman with a soft heart, he tests Dutch's grand declarations with practical questions. Who decides who is corrupt? How long can an outlaw family outrun a nation that is laying tracks across the continent? He believes in the dream in the truest sense, yet he also understands risk, consequences, and the need to keep Dutch's rhetoric tethered to reality. By the time the merchant is sent on his way lighter in purse but alive, the real transaction has already occurred. Conflict has turned to friendship, rivalry to partnership. Dutch and Hosea choose to stop working against each other and start building something together, a roaming, half-utopian, half-criminal experiment that will become the living embodiment of their shared philosophy. But how long can such a fragile balance between idealism and outlaw survival truly last, once more lost souls begin to gather around them? What began as two conmen deciding not to rob each other slowly hardened into something far more ambitious. From its humble beginnings as a partnership of convenience, Dutch and Hosea started sketching out a philosophy, a story of freedom and family that would carry their names across the dying frontier. Dutch spoke first and loudest. In campfire speeches and smoky saloons, he painted a world where the gang lived beyond the reach of government agents, bankers, and railroad barons, those faceless forces he saw as strangling the West. He promised a chosen family that answered to no law but its own code. A roaming community where the poor, the hunted, and the misfit could stand together against a civilization built on exploitation. To Dutch, robbing a train or a bank was not just theft, it was resistance. But raw idealism does not keep people fed or alive. That was where Hosea came in. Where Dutch saw grand gestures, Hosea saw ledgers, routes, and exit plans. He pushed Dutch to think about risk, about when to walk away, about the thin line between robbing the rich and becoming predators themselves. When Dutch raged against the railroads, Hosea quietly asked how many Pinkertons those railroads could afford to hire. In the truest sense, he was the editor of Dutch's dreams, trimming, questioning, and reshaping them into something that might actually work. Together, they built the gang as a utopian experiment on horseback, a mobile commune of outcasts, misfits, and orphans, drifting from state to state, setting up camps that felt more like villages than hideouts. Crime became a language, a way to say no to a world that had already said no to them. Every new recruit was treated as a lost soul to be saved from the cruelty of the modern world, folded into a family where meals were shared, songs were sung, and loyalty was prized above all. Yet even in these early years, contradictions sat at the center of Dutch's philosophy. He preached freedom, but expected obedience the moment he gave an order. He condemned the banks for exploiting the weak, then planned heists that put terrified coach drivers and clerks in the line of fire. He spoke of family, of equality around the campfire, yet clearly enjoyed standing above that circle, the living embodiment of his own legend. Was this liberation, or the first draft of a cult? The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, but Dutch refused to bend. His certainty, his charisma, his refusal to compromise made him magnetic, especially to young men like Arthur and later, John. Those same qualities, though, carried a darker promise. A leader who cannot admit doubt cannot admit fault. A father who demands absolute loyalty cannot tolerate questions. The tragedy is that the seeds of Dutch's future paranoia and cruelty were present from the very beginning, waiting for one disaster, one betrayal, to bring them to the surface and start tearing this fragile experiment apart. Those seeds did not stay buried for long. Once Dutch and Hosea committed to this experiment, the question became simple and terrifying. How do two dreamers turn a philosophy into a family? And a family into an outlaw band that can survive as the world was changing around them? The answer, from its humble beginnings, lay in who they chose to save. Dutch and Hosea started looking for people chewed up and spat out by civilization, orphans sleeping in alleys, drifters run out of railroad towns, abused kids hiding bruises under threadbare shirts, desperate families one bad harvest away from starvation. They offered food first, then warmth, then a place by the fire. Protection, purpose, and, in the truest sense, belonging. To the outside world, it was a gang. To those who joined, it felt like the only home left. A pattern emerged. Dutch would find a lost soul on the edge of some small-town jail or charity orphanage, and he would step in as if the universe had sent him. He loved the story of breaking someone out of a prison wagon, of pulling a child from under the boot of a cruel guardian, of feeding a hungry mother and her kids after a bad winter. Each rescue was retold around the campfire until it became legend. Dutch cast himself not as a thief or fugitive, but as a liberator, the living embodiment of resistance to a rigged system that punished the weak and rewarded the rich. Of course, someone had to make sure those rescued mouths could be fed, and that those rescued tempers did not get everyone killed. That was Hosea. Where Dutch spoke of freedom and dreams, Hosea taught angles and limits. He showed new recruits how to pick pockets without being seen, how to run a con without leaving bodies, how to disappear before the law even knew a crime had been committed. If Dutch dragged them out of the fire, Hosea taught them how not to leap back in. Together they formed a rhythm, Dutch inspiring loyalty with grand speeches, Hosea quietly correcting course when those speeches drifted toward recklessness. Struggling between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization, the gang learned to rob with restraint, to move on before blood feuds started, to keep violence as a tool rather than an impulse. For a time, it worked. The old ways were dying, but in the shadows of railroads and telegraph lines, this wandering camp became a story of survival through cunning, rather than brute force. Each new face around the fire was more than another rifle. Every recruit was proof that Dutch's philosophy could reach into the ruins of a life and pull out loyalty. If he could take broken people and turn them into believers, did that not mean his worldview was right? Every orphan who called him Mr. van der Linde, every drifter who repeated his lines about the government and the rich, became both child and scripture, both person and argument. And then came the first real test of that argument. Not a nameless drifter, not a passing family, but a boy whose entire future would be written by Dutch's hand. A teenager caught between crime and hunger, between abandonment and adoption. His name was Arthur Morgan, and his life would become the mirror of Dutch's rise and fall. Arthur Morgan's story does not begin with heroism. It begins with absence. A boy born into a world that had already given up on him, raised by a man who treated crime as a trade and parenthood as an afterthought. From its humble beginnings, his life is a ledger of neglect. His father, Lyle Morgan, was an outlaw in the truest sense. Petty robberies, drunken brawls, small time schemes that never quite paid off. Arthur grew up watching his father hauled off by sheriffs, hearing doors slam, feeling the quiet that follows when a household realizes no one is coming back with food. By the time Lyle died in a bar fight, the world had already stamped Arthur as worthless, another future prisoner in a civilization that measured value in land deeds and factory output. The world was changing, and there was no place for a half-wild boy who only knew how to steal. So he stole. Livestock, purses, anything that kept hunger away for one more night. Arrest was inevitable. A teenager, angry and exhausted, thrown into a cell that seemed less a punishment and more a confirmation of what everyone had always believed. This was who he was destined to be, a lost soul, filed away by the state. And then Dutch and Hosea walked in. They found him not on the open road, but behind iron bars, a scowling kid who met their eyes without flinching. Dutch saw toughness, defiance, a spark that refused to go out. Hosea saw something else: fear, confusion, the raw clay of a boy who had never been taught another way to exist. In a scene that quietly defines the very beginning of their philosophy, they did not leave him to rot. They talked the lawman down, pulled some strings, and walked Arthur out instead of walking past. From that moment, the dual mentorship began. Dutch filled Arthur's head with ideas, freedom from corrupt government, loyalty to family over institutions, a higher purpose to every robbery. Crime, Dutch insisted, could be a protest, a story of resistance written in stolen bills and broken chains. Hosea, ever the skeptic, gave him tools rather than speeches. He taught Arthur how to scout a town, how to read a mark, how to hunt and track and question every plan twice. Dutch gave him a cause, Hosea gave him a brain. To Dutch, Arthur became more than a proc. He became a surrogate son, the living embodiment of Dutch's belief that a man cast aside by civilization could be remade into something noble. Arthur drank in the campfire orations, internalized the philosophy, chased Dutch's approval with every job done clean, every hostage spared, every lawman outwitted instead of killed. When Dutch said, "We are building something better," Arthur believed him. Completely. And that belief is the quiet tragedy coiled at the center of this saga. Because when a man builds his entire identity on another's dream, what happens when that dream begins to crack? When the father figure who saved him starts to sound less idealistic and more delusional? Those questions will not be answered in a single gunfight or a single betrayal. They will unfold slowly, frame by frame, until the boy Dutch decided to save is forced to decide whether he can save Dutch from himself, or whether it is already far too late. Those questions begin in the quiet years, long before Blackwater, when Arthur Morgan is not a dying man searching his soul, but a boy being given one. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang is not just an outlaw crew. It is a classroom, a church, a family in the truest sense, and Dutch and Hosea are writing the scripture. The early robberies are small and almost intimate. Stagecoaches taken on lonely roads, stores shaken down in backwater towns, the occasional train hit planned more for the thrill than the haul. Afterward, there are long nights around the campfire, coffee boiling, smoke hanging low, Dutch turning every crime into a sermon about freedom and civilization. He speaks of railroads as chains, of banks as parasites, of the government as a machine grinding the individual into dust. To Arthur, fresh from a father who drank himself into an early grave, this is not just rhetoric. It is a story of why his pain exists and how to turn it into purpose. Over time, Dutch's cadence becomes the rhythm in Arthur's own head. The journal entries tell the tale frame by frame. Arthur writes about civilization as a sickness, about the world closing in, about the old ways we're dying beneath the boots of men in suits. His words echo Dutch so closely that it is hard to tell where the philosophy ends and the boy begins. When Dutch says they are the living embodiment of freedom, Arthur believes it, because on those nights under the stars, it feels true. Hosea, though, offers a different education. Where Dutch stands, gestures, declaims, Hosea sits, watches, and questions. Dutch teaches Arthur to read books and speeches. Hosea teaches him to read faces, tracks, and bad weather. Dutch tells him that civilization is the enemy. Hosea reminds him that hunger, cold, and a bullet in the back care little for speeches. One father is grand and idealistic, the other quiet and skeptical, and Arthur lives suspended between them, struggling between dreams and reality, between freedom and survival. There is a quiet irony here. Every time Arthur proves loyal, brave, and almost principled in his own outlaw way, it feels to him like honoring both men. But for Dutch, it becomes something more dangerous: confirmation. Arthur's courage is proof that the philosophy works, that his gang really is building a better world than the one they rob. The validation loop closes. Dutch speaks, Arthur believes, Arthur acts, and Dutch sees his own reflection shining back. Then comes the pattern interrupt. The next boy they bring in will not reflect Dutch so cleanly. John Marston will grow up hearing the same speeches, riding on the same jobs, yet he will question, resent, and push back in ways Arthur rarely dares. Where Arthur becomes the believer, John will become the test, the ideological foil who refuses to stay in the role Dutch writes for him. And Dutch, who needs control as much as he needs worship, will not take that challenge lightly. Dutch's need for control meets its sharpest resistance in the boy who should have been easiest to mold. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang had been a story of stray souls gathered and given purpose. John Marston arrives as another stray, but his scars run in a different direction, cutting straight through Dutch's carefully crafted philosophy of family and faith. John's life before the gang is a catalog of abandonment. His mother dies when he is young, his father is a drunk who barely knows his name, and the state treats him not as a child, but as a problem to be stored. He is shuffled through orphanages where discipline means beatings, where charity comes with humiliation, where every adult who claims to care eventually disappears or turns cruel. In that world, the old ways were dying, but nothing better had replaced them, only institutions and indifference. John runs away early, living off scraps, petty theft, and quick feet, learning that survival depends on trusting no one. So when Dutch finds him, half-starved and defiant, the pattern repeats, but the reaction does not. Dutch offers food, warmth, and a place by the fire, framing it as a rescue from a civilization that chews up children and spits them out. It is, in the truest sense, the same speech Arthur once heard, promises of freedom, of family, of a life beyond the reach of cruel authority. Dutch sees another lost soul to redeem, another proof that his worldview is righteous. Arthur leans into that promise. He responds with loyalty, obedience, a willingness to be shaped. John does not. Even as he eats Dutch's food and sleeps under Dutch's protection, he holds something back. His gratitude comes wrapped in sarcasm, his respect in barbed questions. When Dutch lays out a grand plan, John is often the first to ask, and what if it goes wrong? When Dutch rails against the government, John quietly wonders whether Dutch's hatred of civilization excuses the bodies left behind. This tension fascinates Dutch. John's skepticism is both a challenge and an opportunity, a chance to prove that his philosophy can win over even the most damaged heart. Dutch spends extra time with him, praising his potential, defending him when his recklessness causes trouble. Arthur notices. The man who was once the only son now watches a new heir being courted, and resentment flickers beneath his practiced loyalty. Two boys from the gutter, each believing, on some level, that Dutch is choosing between them. Over time, John settles into the gang, but never fully into the spell. He rides on the same robberies, hears the same speeches, bleeds for the same dreams, yet he always stands a half step to the side, testing Dutch's words against the world he sees. That distance will matter. As Dutch drifts further into delusions and grand, suicidal plans, John will be the one who finally refuses to follow. And that refusal will not just wound Dutch's pride. It will help shatter the entire illusion holding the gang together, setting the stage for the first real fractures to break wide open. John's refusal will become the crack in the dam, but the pressure behind it is built in quieter, earlier days, when Arthur and John are still only half-formed men orbiting Dutch's sun. From its humble beginnings, their relationship is a story of rivalry and reluctant brotherhood, of two outlaws raised on the same philosophy, yet hearing very different sermons in Dutch's words. From the very beginning, Arthur sees John as an interloper, Arthur is the first son, the one Dutch taught to read, to think, to dream of freedom beyond civilization's fences. John arrives later, half wild, a street thief Dutch plucks from the gutter. At first, Arthur views him as a scrappy newcomer who has not earned Dutch's trust, a boy trying to skip the line into a family Arthur bled to build. There is protectiveness in that stance, but also a quiet resentment. Who is this kid Dutch suddenly cares so much about? As they ride together, that resentment twists into something more complex. Arthur watches John take risks Dutch praises as bold, the kind of independence Dutch once celebrated in Arthur. The older outlaw becomes the responsible one, the man sent to clean up messes and keep the camp fed, while John is allowed to chase glory. Dutch feeds this dynamic deliberately. With Arthur, he speaks of loyalty, of duty, of being the rock the gang stands on. With John, he praises spirit, questions, the refusal to be tamed. Two different compliments, aimed at two different needs, both reinforcing Dutch as the living embodiment of father, teacher, and judge. Over time, that difference hardens into ideology. Arthur becomes the believer, the man who wants Dutch's philosophy to be true even when the world was changing around them. He clings to the speeches about destiny and freedom as if they can still hold back the old ways we're dying. John, in contrast, is never fully converted. He enjoys the family, the campfires, the sense of belonging, but he hears Dutch's grand declarations as just that, declarations. Inspiring, perhaps, but not a map for life. This split surfaces in small, telling moments. Arthur scolds John for disappearing when Abigail and Jack need him, arguing that a man owes the gang and his family both. John fires back that Dutch's plans keep dragging them into suicidal robberies, that a future on the run is no future for a child. In missions where Dutch pushes for one more risk, Arthur tries to believe, insisting Dutch knows best, while John questions the cost. Who are they really fighting for now? Some idealistic dream, or Dutch's pride? As the gang grows and the world closes in, Dutch's favor shifts with his own unraveling mind. On days when he still imagines himself a noble outlaw, he leans toward Arthur, the faithful disciple. When paranoia takes hold and he needs someone to blame, he looks to John, the skeptic who mirrors his own buried doubts. Their brotherly rivalry becomes a barometer of Dutch's sanity, swinging wildly as his delusions deepen, until one fateful decision will force Dutch to choose a son, and reveal just how far his mind has already fallen. That choice between sons does not happen in a vacuum. It happens inside a moving nation of wagons, fires, and frightened hearts that Dutch himself has built. From its humble beginnings as a trio of dreamers and thieves, the Van der Linde gang swells into a traveling civilization in miniature. A story of freedom and family rolling on wooden wheels across a continent that no longer wants them. What begins with Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur soon becomes something far larger than a robbery crew. Women and children gather around the fire, sharpshooters clean their rifles beside swindlers counting cards, and stray drifters find a place at the stew pot. In the truest sense, this caravan is the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, a self-made world where the state holds no power, where loyalty replaces law. It looks beautiful from a distance. Up close, the cracks are already there. New faces arrive with their own fractured histories, each one reshaping Dutch's self-image as a protector of the marginalized. Sadie Adler is dragged from the ashes of her burned homestead, a widow in a blood-soaked dress, saved from O'Driscoll's and reborn as a vengeful gunfighter under Dutch's banner. Javier Escuela brings tales of failed revolution and lost comrades, a former idealistic fighter who hears in Dutch's speeches an echo of uprisings that never quite succeeded. Bill Williamson, all bluster and insecurity, clings to the gang because outside its circle, he is just another frightened gun hand. Charles Smith, of mixed native and African heritage, carries the weight of two worlds that civilization is trying to erase. To Dutch, each is proof that his camp is sanctuary, that his outlaw nation is rescuing every lost soul the modern world discards. The camps themselves become chapters in his mind. Coulter, buried in snow after Blackwater, is survival and denial. Horseshoe Overlook is recovery and renewed confidence, the illusion that the old ways were not yet dying. Clemens Point, with its warm nights and growing prosperity, feels almost domestic, a fleeting peak where dreams seem within reach. Then Shady Bell, rotting in the swamps, announces the rot in Dutch's plans, the damp, creaking floorboards mirroring the sag in his authority. Each relocation is not just a change of scenery, it is a structural beat in his breakdown. All the while, the world was changing faster than the wagons can roll. Trains thunder past their camps, telegraph lines stitch the horizon. Pinkertons appear with warrants and rifles, and oil barons like Leviticus Cornwall tighten an invisible net of money and law. Dutch keeps insisting that careful planning and belief will outmaneuver it all. Does faith beat railroads? Does bravado outrun a telegram? Growth becomes a curse as much as a blessing. More mouths to feed, more people to hide, more hearts depending on one man's plans. Every new recruit is another reason Dutch needs that mythical one last score, another weight on a mind already bending under grief and pride. The caravan looks powerful, even unstoppable. In truth, it is a slow-moving target, rolling straight toward the moment where Dutch's promises and reality finally collide. The caravan finally slows at Horseshoe Overlook, and for a moment, it feels as if the world itself takes a breath. After the blizzard at Coulter, the open plains of New Hanover seem impossibly wide, rolling grass, distant tree lines, a sky that does not press down but stretches out. The gang fans across the ridge, wagons creaking, horses snorting, and Dutch van der Linde walks among them in the truest sense as a shepherd among his flock. Here, the camp becomes the living embodiment of his philosophy at its most convincing. Tents rise in a loose circle, a fire crackles at the center, and the sound of Javier's guitar drifts through the dusk. Children chase each other between crates and bedrolls. For a brief chapter, this outlaw village feels less like a hiding place and more like a small, defiant civilization carved out of a hostile world. From its humble beginnings in backroom saloons and back alley robberies, the van der Linde gang now looks almost respectable, almost permanent. Dutch seizes that illusion and gives it words. One evening, he stands near the main fire, coat flaring, voice carrying over clinking bottles and quiet conversations. He speaks of Blackwater as a mere setback, not a failure. He swears that the ferry job was not the end of their dreams, but a detour on the road to freedom out west. There will be land, he promises. There will be money. There will be a place beyond the reach of government and railroads where the old ways are not yet dying. The reactions around the fire tell a story of their own. Arthur leans on a post, half amused, half moved, the loyal son who has heard these speeches since the very beginning, yet still finds himself believing. Hosea watches with a small, knowing smile, hearing both the performance and the man behind it. Bill laughs too loudly, Javier nods along in rhythm, Tilly and Mary Beth listen with shining eyes. Lenny, still new, looks at Dutch as if he has found a father rather than a boss. For a time, this feels less like a cult and more like family, and Dutch, crucially, still earns it. When he talks about sharing the spoils, he actually does. When he rails against senseless cruelty, he still reins in Bill or Micah before things go too far. After the Cornwall train robbery, he spares the hostages, insisting they are not murderers, that this is a story of resistance, not slaughter. Words and actions still mostly match. Yet even here, the first fractures glint beneath the surface. Dutch cannot speak of Blackwater without insisting he was betrayed. Someone talked. Someone failed him. Responsibility slides away from his own choices and onto invisible enemies. He repeats the same line, almost a mantra, "You just gotta trust me." Once, it is reassurance. Twice, it is habit. By the 10th time, it sounds closer to a warning. From Horseshoe Overlook onward, his mind can be tracked through these speeches. The hopeful sermons at this camp, framed by open sky and easy laughter, will one day echo against the rotten caves of Beaver Hollow as dark, paranoid rants. The words stay similar. The man saying them does not. From that point on, every calm speech at camp is standing in the shadow of something the player never fully sees. The Blackwater ferry job is the wound under Dutch's coat, the one that never stops bleeding, the one everyone talks around rather than through. On paper, it should have been the culmination of Dutch's philosophy. A rich town, a crowded dock, a ferry loaded with cash, bonds, and the promise of a future where the gang could finally buy its way out of civilization's reach. Instead, it becomes a story of chaos, a robbery gone wrong, gunfire on the water, heavy casualties, and the gang's greatest score slipping beneath the waves along with the bodies. In the truest sense, Blackwater is where the dream dies and the nightmare begins. The facts are simple enough. Dutch makes a call on that boat, a call that leads to innocent deaths and to the Pinkertons closing in faster than he ever imagined. The gang flees in panic, abandoning money, allies, and the illusion of control, clawing its way into the blizzard of Coulter from its humble beginnings on that sunlit dock. Yet Rockstar never shows the full scene. No clear frame of the first shot fired, no definitive answer on who betrayed whom. Instead, Blackwater exists in fragments. Hosea's regretful mutters by the fire, Micah's insinuations about cowardice and hesitation, Arthur's journal entries, circling the event without quite landing on it. Each retelling reveals less about the ferry itself and more about the speaker's guilt, fear, or need to shift blame. What really happened that day? The game refuses to pin it down, turning the heist into a kind of mythic trauma that haunts every conversation. Dutch's own language is the most revealing. When he speaks of Blackwater, he invokes betrayal, bad luck, treachery from within, and pressure from without. He rarely frames it as miscalculation. The problem was not the plan, in his mind, but the world. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and his grand gesture was ruined by forces beyond his control. So he clings to a new fantasy. One last big score that will make it all right. One job to erase the ferry, to prove that the genius of Dutch van der Linde still shines. From that moment, paranoia becomes his closest companion. The Pinkertons are always one step behind, because in his head they are always watching. Enemies are everywhere, in Blackwater, in Rhodes, in St. Denis, in his own camp. Only he can outthink them, if his family will only listen, only obey, only trust. Every "I have a plan" becomes less a promise to the gang and more a desperate argument with the memory of that boat. By the time the story reaches Beaver Hollow, those words are no longer leadership at all. They are a man arguing with a ghost. And that ghost is about to demand another sacrifice. And that ghost has a name. Colm O'Driscoll. From the very beginning, Colm is not just a rival, not just another outlaw carving a bloody trail through a dying frontier. He is a dark reflection of Dutch himself, another charismatic leader with his own twisted philosophy, another man preaching freedom while building a small, brutal civilization of fear. In Colm, Dutch sees everything he claims to hate. In Colm, he also sees what he might become. Their feud is a story of pride and poison stretching back years. From its humble beginnings as two young thieves trying to rob the same stagecoach, to the moment Colm kills Annabelle and turns a petty rivalry into a holy war. What starts as competition for territory and reputation becomes something far more personal, a ledger of insults and blood that Dutch cannot allow to remain unpaid. Every ambush, every kidnapping, every betrayal is no longer about survival. It is about scorekeeping. By 1899, the O'Driscoll conflict is less a gang war and more a mirror Dutch cannot stop staring into. When Dutch drags Arthur, Javier, and others into those early ambushes near Horseshoe Overlook, the tactical logic is thin. The gang is wounded from Blackwater, low on ammunition and morale, yet Dutch insists on hitting Colm again and again, as if every dead O'Driscoll might erase his own failures. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but Dutch clings to this feud as proof that his philosophy still matters. The clearest fracture comes when Dutch agrees to Colm's supposed truce in Valentine's shadow. On paper, it is an opportunity for negotiation. In practice, it is a trap that any calmer mind would see coming. Dutch walks into it anyway, not because it is wise, but because the idea of Colm outmaneuvering him is unbearable. Arthur ends up hanging from a rope, beaten and bleeding, while Dutch's plan consists of blind faith that his enemy cannot be smarter than he is. Pride replaces reason. Ego replaces leadership. Arthur and Hosea feel the shift. Hosea, the man who once tempered Dutch's rage, starts to question whether his oldest friend is chasing philosophy or ghosts. Arthur, watching Dutch risk lives for the satisfaction of revenge, wonders who exactly this war is serving. Yet when doubts surface, Dutch answers not with reflection but with accusation. Any hesitation becomes betrayal, any concern becomes disloyalty. He tightens his emotional grip with speeches about honor, family, and payback, insisting that striking Colm is striking at all the forces trying to crush them. In the truest sense, Colm becomes a symbol Dutch cannot release, and that is the pattern that will define the end. Grudges against Colm, Cornwall, and the government fusing into one grand obsession, one last delusion of total victory. A man who once preached freedom will choose his vendettas over his family, sacrificing everything he claims to love rather than admit the war is already lost. If Colm O'Driscoll is the ghost Dutch cannot stop chasing, then Leviticus Cornwall is the wall he refuses to see until it is far too late. The story shifts from personal feud to industrial war, from its humble beginnings in backroom saloons to the heart of a changing world made of steel, schedules, and shareholders. The world was changing, and Dutch decides to punch the train itself. The first big robbery on Cornwall's line is framed as a righteous act. Dutch presents it as a blow against a greedy industrialist, a man who bleeds towns dry and buys the law wholesale. It is a story of resistance and survival, of family needing to refill its coffers after Blackwater, and of an outlaw philosophy that still pretends to be noble. Dutch stands on that ridge above the tracks and talks about freedom, about striking back at civilization before it buries them. To Arthur, to the gang, this feels almost heroic. Almost, what happens on that train matters more than the money. Dutch still handles the hostages with a measure of restraint. He barks, he threatens, but he does not indulge in pointless slaughter. Passengers are shoved, not executed. Guards are disarmed, not massacred. Arthur can still tell himself they are different from the monsters they rob, that this is targeted violence against the rich. Not cruelty for its own sake. In the truest sense, this is the last moment where the gang's code and Dutch's actions still mostly align. Cornwall's response shatters that illusion. Instead of a distant, faceless tycoon, Cornwall rides in with armed men, Pinkertons, and an appetite for total control. He burns their hideouts, leans on local law, and makes it clear he will never negotiate. Only crush. A cautious leader might fade into the hills, change names, change targets. Dutch does the opposite. He escalates. He robs more trains, more stages, more Cornwall assets, turning one successful heist into a personal war the gang cannot truly win. What begins as a tactical strike becomes a vendetta to match Colm's. Dutch's body language in these confrontations tells the truth his speeches try to hide. He paces tighter circles, eyes glittering, shoulders wound high as if he is holding the whole world on his back. His temper snaps faster, especially when anyone suggests retreat. Yet there is an almost intoxicated edge to him. Outsmarting Cornwall, slipping away from Pinkertons on horseback or through city alleys, convinces him he is still the genius leader from the very beginning, the living embodiment of his own legend. Every escape is proof, to him, that the old ways were not dying, that his dreams are not delusions. But the pattern is set. Every threat becomes a grand ideological showdown, every setback a chance to double down. How long before the targets stop being industrialists and start being whoever stands in his way? How long before there is no moral or strategic justification left at all, only pride and paranoia dressed up as philosophy? The pattern begins to surface at the campfire, not in gunfights or grand heists, but in the quiet moments when Dutch gathers his family and tells them what the world is, and what it could be. At Horseshoe Overlook, his voice still carries the warmth of from its humble beginnings. The gang is bruised from Coulter and Blackwater, but there is music, there is stew, there is laughter. Dutch stands before them and speaks of freedom in the truest sense, of land out west, of one last score to buy a future where civilization cannot touch them. His words are inclusive, visionary, almost tender. We are going to be free, he promises, and that we is the living embodiment of his old philosophy, a story of outcasts banding together against a rigged world. Listen closely to that early speech. I have a plan. In that moment, it is reassurance, not command. Gotta keep faith. It is an invitation to share a dream, not a demand to silence doubt. Arthur leans nearby, half smiling, nodding along, the loyal son, hearing the same sermon he has heard since the very beginning. His journal in this era still reflects admiration, cautious but genuine belief that Dutch's dreams might survive even as the old ways were dying. By Clemens Point and Shady Bell, the words are the same, but the music has changed. The Rhodes feud, Sean's death, Jack's kidnapping, the St. Denis disasters, each has carved something out of Dutch. Around the later campfires, his speeches grow harder, more brittle. I have a plan is repeated again and again, but now it lands as a shield, a wall thrown up against questions he no longer wants to answer. You gotta keep faith becomes a warning. We're going to be free sounds less like a destination and more like an excuse. The inclusiveness drains out. The tone shifts from we to they. Dutch rails at traitors, at cowards, at those who do not understand his vision. The government, the O'Driscolls, Bronte, Cornwall, even the hesitant within his own camp all blur into one great enemy. The rhetoric of resistance curdles into the rhetoric of persecution. Arthur's reaction tracks that slide frame by frame. Where once he stood close, now he hangs back, smoking in silence, eyes lowered or turned away. The camera often lingers on him as Dutch speaks, catching the tight jaw, the weary glance. In his journal, the language shifts. Dutch talks big. Dutch keeps saying he has a plan. Dutch promises miracles after every disaster. Admiration gives way to unease, then to a quiet, dawning dread. The gang feels it too. Early on, Dutch's speeches end with cheers, dancing, Javier's guitar cutting through the night. Later, the same words fall into tense silence, broken by side conversations. Javier still clings to every sentence, echoing Dutch's lines with near religious loyalty, while Bill, Pearson, and others mutter their fears at the edges of the firelight. The family is still sitting in a circle, but the circle has already broken. Viewed through the eyes of a therapist, each campfire sermon becomes a diary entry Dutch is writing to himself, revising the story so he never has to confess failure. The more reality contradicts his philosophy, the louder he insists on his plan. And the question hangs over the flames. When the words finally stop working on the gang, what will he reach for next? What he reaches for is distance. And the story rips him out of everything he knows to give it to him. The Saint Denis bank job is the breaking point in the old world of the gang. Hosea is murdered in the street, Lenny is shot on the rooftop, and Dutch's grand design collapses in gunsmoke and sirens. In the chaos of the escape, the survivors flee to the docks, seize a ship, and vanish into the night. But the world was changing, and even the ocean will not carry them back to their former freedom. The shipwreck on Guarma feels almost unreal, a fever dream after the orderly brutality of Saint Denis. One moment, the gang is battling Pinkertons in a civilized city. The next, Arthur staggers onto a tropical beach, half dead, with no horses, no camp, and no familiar landmarks. From its humble beginnings on snowy ridges and muddy plains, this outlaw family is suddenly dropped into a colonial nightmare of sugar plantations, private armies, and a revolution that has nothing to do with their philosophy, yet will soon be twisted into Dutch's newest justification. Guarma strips Dutch of context. There are no O'Driscolls to blame, no Pinkerton names to curse, no territory to reclaim in the name of some imagined frontier. There is only chaos, foreign tongues, and a power struggle he barely understands. In the truest sense, the island is a mirror held up to Dutch's mind, confused, violent, searching for a side to claim so the story can remain about him. So he finds one. He latches onto the rebels, not out of loyalty, but because their suffering can be converted into his rhetoric. Here, the shift becomes unmistakable. Dutch grows more ruthless, more willing to sacrifice strangers and friends alike, as long as the sacrifice can be framed as necessary. When he helps lead the assault on Fusar's men, the plan is painted as liberation, a blow against oppression, a pure expression of his old ideals. Yet the bodies left in the mud are mostly locals whose names he never learns. Survival, he insists. The greater good, he claims. But the camera lingers on Arthur's face, and the gap between words and reality widens. Watch Dutch's eyes on Guarma. There are glassy stares where once there were sharp, mocking glances. His shoulders slump when he thinks no one is looking, then snap back as he launches into another speech about destiny and betrayal. He flies into sudden rages, barking orders at Javier, dismissing Arthur's doubts, treating the deaths around them as narrative fuel rather than human loss. The living embodiment of his own myth, he cannot afford to grieve, he can only repurpose tragedy. Then comes the quiet horror, the sense that Guarma is not a detour, but a pressure cooker. Every gunfight, every dead rebel, every desperate choice compresses Dutch's fear and pride into something harder, colder. When the survivors finally return to the mainland, the man who steps off that boat is not the same leader who boarded the ship in Saint Denis. The island has given him exactly what his delusions needed. Proof that the world is against him, and that only he can rewrite the rules, and once back in America he will try. But the land he returns to is poorer, hungrier, and far less willing to believe. The land Dutch returns to is poorer, hungrier, and far less willing to believe. And so the gang is pushed into the one place that reflects their new reality with cruel precision: Beaver Hollow. Beaver Hollow is not a camp. It is a wound in the earth, a dark, damp cave buried in the woods, far from towns, far from sunlight, far from the easy charm of Valentine or the warm nights at Clemens Point. From its humble beginnings around open fires and open skies, the van der Linde gang now squeezes itself into a cramped hollow that feels less like a home and more like a hiding place. In the truest sense, the environment has finally caught up with Dutch's mind. Here, the change in daily life is immediate and unsettling. Gone are the evenings of songs and stories, the sound of Javier's guitar drifting across the trees, the sense of a ramshackle family clinging to a dream of freedom. In Beaver Hollow, people huddle in the shadows, whispering, arguing, staring at the cave walls as if they might close in at any moment. The fires are smaller, the food is scarcer, the laughter is almost extinct. What was once a traveling village has become a bunker. At the center of that bunker, Dutch and Micah whisper plans in the darkness. They stand apart from the others, heads close, voices low, the glow of the fire catching the hard edges of their faces. There is a quiet, almost bitter irony here. For years, Dutch preached community and loyalty, yet now his world has shrunk to one man who tells him exactly what he wants to hear. The rest of the gang becomes silhouettes in the background, while Micah becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses. Dutch's speeches in Beaver Hollow complete this transformation. Earlier, his words were grand and sweeping, a story of resistance against civilization, of outlaws standing proud as the old ways were dying. Now, the rhythm is harsher, the content narrower. He talks less about freedom and more about obedience, less about a better world and more about sacrifice, blood, and traitors. Every setback is blamed on rats. Every doubt is framed as betrayal. Is it any wonder that men and women who once rode for an ideal now flinch when their leader raises his voice? The absence of Hosea hangs over all of this. From the very beginning, Hosea had been Dutch's counterweight, the quiet hand on the reins, the friend who could puncture a delusion with a single skeptical look. In Beaver Hollow, that balance is gone. In its place stands Micah Bell, a yes-man and provocateur, feeding Dutch's paranoia, urging more violence, more risk, more cruelty. Without Hosea to argue, Dutch's philosophy curdles unchecked, turning from flexible code into rigid dogma. By the time the gang settles into Beaver Hollow, the transformation is complete. This is no longer an idealistic family of outlaws chasing dreams on the edge of civilization. It has become a doomsday cult in a cave, waiting for a miracle score, a miracle escape, a miracle future that will never come. The plans grow wilder, the faith grows thinner, and the cave waits, patient and silent, for the inevitable collapse. The question now is not whether the dream will die, but who Dutch will sacrifice to keep pretending it still lives. In that cave at Beaver Hollow, as the dream curdles into a delusion, a new voice rises to fill the silence Hosea left behind. It is not the voice of conscience or caution. It is the voice of Micah Bell. From the very beginning of his time with the gang, Micah stands as the anti-Hosea. Where Hosea is quiet, observant, and measured, Micah is loud, cruel, and impulsive. Hosea believes in a philosophy, in a story of freedom and family held together by some fragile sense of honor. Micah believes in chaos, in survival, in staying as close as possible to whoever holds power, then twisting that power toward blood and profit. He is, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of everything Dutch once claimed to resist. Yet, as the old ways were dying and the world was changing around them, Dutch begins to see in Micah not a threat, but a reflection. Micah flatters him relentlessly, calling him the man with the plan, praising every wild scheme, insisting that only Dutch can lead them out of this tightening noose. Where Arthur questions, Micah applauds. Where John hesitates, Micah sneers. This flattery is not harmless. It becomes the fuel for Dutch's unraveling ego. At Beaver Hollow, Micah is always at Dutch's shoulder, whispering that Arthur is turning against him, that John is weak, that the others have lost faith. When Arthur confronts Dutch about the torture of the traitorous O'Driscoll, Micah is there, mocking Arthur's compassion, urging Dutch to be strong. Dutch chooses Micah. He chooses validation over truth, brutality over doubt. Again and again, key moments reveal this shift. In Saint Denis, after Bronte's death, Arthur and the others are horrified by Dutch's cold execution of the man who had just dined with them. Micah, however, laughs and calls it justice, feeding Dutch the idea that mercy is weakness. Later, when John is left behind during the train escape near Beaver Hollow, Arthur argues to go back. Micah calls John a liability, a traitor waiting to happen. Dutch listens to Micah. Micah weaponizes Dutch's paranoia with surgical precision. He brings rumors of Pinkerton informants, hints that someone in camp is talking, always nudging suspicion toward those who question Dutch's plans. Each whispered warning pushes Dutch further into the cave, further away from the campfires where his family once gathered. The gang fragments into those who still cling to the old philosophy, and those who orbit Dutch and Micah's growing cult of personality. Freedom gives way to fear. By the time Arthur discovers that Micah is the real rat, feeding information to Milton, Dutch is so entangled in Micah's narrative that truth feels like betrayal. On that final cliff, with Arthur on one side and Micah on the other, Dutch is not just choosing between two men. He is choosing between the man he once tried to be and the monster Micah has helped him become. The question is simple and devastating. Is there anything left of Dutch van der Linde beneath all that manipulation and madness? Or has the mirror already shattered beyond repair? That shattered mirror is nowhere clearer than in Saint Denis, under the gaslights and marble columns of Angelo Bronte's world. If the cliff is Dutch's end, Bronte is the moment he first steps over the edge, not by accident, but by choice. This is a story of a man who once railed against civilization, suddenly desperate to be invited into its drawing rooms. From its humble beginnings, the gang defined itself against the rich and the powerful, but in Saint Denis, Dutch chooses to play their game. He flatters Bronte, attends garden parties, trades barbs with mayors and industrialists, all while whispering about freedom and family to his own people. He is struggling between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization. And in that tension, something poisonous starts to grow. The plan to rob the Saint Denis Bank is presented as one last righteous score, yet it depends entirely on the very system he claims to despise. The mansion rescue of Jack crystallizes this double life. Dutch arrives in a tailored suit, hat-tipped, voice smooth as silk. He jokes with Bronte, compliments the house, plays the part of the cultured outlaw in the truest sense. Every word is a performance, every smile a calculated move. Two criminals, each planning to use the other, sharing cigars in a gilded cage. The irony is almost theatrical, the so-called revolutionary begging favors from a crime lord who is the living embodiment of the very corruption Dutch built his philosophy against. But the mask slips on that boat ride back through the bayou. When Bronte insults the gang, calls them animals, mocks Dutch's dreams, the scene turns. The camera lingers on Dutch's face, the smile freezes, the eyes go distant, then cold. Without warning, he drags Bronte down and holds him under the filthy water, still smiling, almost serene. It is sudden, brutal, and disturbingly intimate. Arthur's horrified stare says everything. This is not the man who once spared hostages and lectured about codes. This is something darker. That drowning is more than a killing, it is a release. Bronte is wealthy, untouchable, condescending, the world Dutch has always blamed for his suffering. Crushing him, slowly, with his bare hands is not strategy. It is personal. It is Dutch punishing the entire idea of civilization through one man's body, exercising his humiliation by becoming exactly what his enemies always claimed he was. In that frame-by-frame descent, the outlaw with a code gives way to a man who enjoys the power of deciding who lives and who dies. From this night on, the old ways were dying inside Dutch. His rhetoric stays the same, but the restraint is gone. And if he can murder an ally in cold blood while his family watches, what line is left for him not to cross next? Dutch's cruelty does not erupt out of nowhere. It creeps in through the cracks of his own rules, and those cracks are easiest to see whenever someone is on their knees in front of him. The way an outlaw treats a hostage is the living embodiment of his code, and Dutch's code changes before the gang's eyes. At the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2's story, during the first Cornwall train robbery in the snow, Dutch makes his philosophy sound simple. The gang storms the private car, guns drawn, rich passengers cowering in terror. Yet Dutch walks among them with a strange, courtly calm. He insists they are not killers of innocence, that this is a robbery, not a massacre, and that the gang is better than common thugs. It is a story of freedom over greed, of rebellion over cruelty, of a family refusing to become the monsters the world already thinks they are. Arthur echoes that stance. He points guns, he shoves people around, but he supports Dutch's restraint, reinforcing the image of an idealistic leader who only spills blood when forced. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang sells itself as an ethical alternative to the brutal civilization closing in: rob the rich, spare the helpless, keep the dream clean. Then the world was changing, and Dutch's hostage rules changed with it. By the time the gang is holed up in Shady Bell and later Beaver Hollow, hostages no longer represent a line he will not cross. They become props in his performance of power. O'Driscoll captives are beaten and executed, their deaths brushed off as practical necessities in a never-ending feud. In Saint Denis, Angelo Bronte is dragged through the bayou, humiliated, then casually drowned and shot in front of the gang, Dutch framing it as justice for betrayal. Once, the rich man in the fancy suit would have been a bargaining chip. Now he is an example. Arthur's responses track this descent frame by frame. At first, he backs Dutch's mercy without question. Later, he hesitates when Dutch orders torture, flinches when prisoners are killed, and starts to ask dangerous questions. Was that really necessary? Or is Dutch enjoying it? By the time Bronte dies choking on swamp water, Arthur's face says what his words soon will. This has gone too far. In the truest sense, Dutch's treatment of hostages becomes a map of his mind. As he feels more cornered, more betrayed by civilization, he broadens the definition of enemy until almost anyone outside the gang is expendable. The banker, the rival outlaw, the informant, the innocent coach passenger who looks at him the wrong way, all are folded into one paranoid category that justifies anything. Track those scenes from the first train to the final camps, and a pattern emerges. Each hostage is a step down, each execution another piece of the old ways dying inside him. Draw that pattern as a graph, and Dutch's moral decay is not a sudden drop. It is a steady, chilling line, heading only one direction. The question then becomes, when his enemies are no longer enough, who ends up next on that line? That line does not just exist in Dutch's actions. It runs quietly through another place entirely, Arthur Morgan's journal. While Dutch fills the world with speeches and gunfire, Arthur fills thin, worn pages with the thoughts he cannot yet bring himself to speak. One man shouts his philosophy to the heavens. The other scratches doubts into paper where no one is supposed to look. From the very beginning, that journal is a love letter to the gang and to Dutch himself. Early entries remember Dutch as the living embodiment of freedom, a man who gave me a home and made me somebody. Arthur writes about Dutch's wisdom, his way with words, his belief that the world was changing and that the Van der Linde gang could stand against the tide of civilization. These are the pages of an idealistic son, convinced his outlaw family is a story of resistance, not mere crime. But read forward, page by page, and the ink begins to turn. After Blackwater, after the botched ferry that is never fully shown but always felt, Arthur's tone shifts from certainty to unease. He wonders if Dutch is chasing dreams and delusions rather than real escape, questions whether every new plan is just another excuse to keep running. Feels like we ain't the rescuers no more, he notes after yet another bloody errand, just the cause of trouble. The praise does not vanish overnight. It rots. The contradictions start to sting. Arthur writes about Dutch talking of freedom while threatening women and children, about preaching loyalty while leaving John behind in the snow, about blaming O'Driscolls, Pinkertons, Cornwall, even the very idea of civilization, for every failure but never once his own hand. After Angelo Bronte's murder, Arthur's scrawl turns harsher. Dutch enjoyed it. He admits, and the man who once lectured him about mercy now feels distant, dangerous, unfamiliar. Then the cough begins. Tuberculosis turns the journal into something else entirely, a mind waking up because it knows time is running out. As Arthur's body fails, his vision sharpens. He writes that he is afraid of what Dutch is becoming, that the gang has lost its way, that all the talk of a final score is nothing more than a story told to keep desperate people obedient. Facing his own end, He grows less willing to accept excuses and more determined to do one good thing before the light goes out. In the truest sense, Arthur's journal becomes the emotional spine of this entire saga. From its humble beginnings as a boy's scrapbook of robberies and campfires, it turns into a record of betrayal, of a father figure who might be the very thing destroying the family he built. The pages are running out. Dutch's plans are running out. And when those two endings finally collide, who will Arthur choose to save? Those pages are running out for a reason. Because the man Arthur is trying to understand on the page once had a conscience standing beside him in the flesh, and that conscience was named Hosea Matthews. From the very beginning, Hosea is more than Dutch's partner in crime. He is the counterweight, the quiet hand on the reins whenever Dutch's philosophy gallops too far ahead of reality. In camp, Hosea is the only one who can mock Dutch's speeches, question his plans, and walk away with a smile rather than a bullet. When others see a charismatic outlaw leader, Hosea sees the flawed man underneath, and he never stops reminding Dutch of the original ideals: freedom, family, and stealing from the powerful rather than preying on the desperate. In the truest sense, Hosea is the living embodiment of what the Linde gang was supposed to be. He prefers cons over gunfights, brains over blood. He is the one who urges restraint in roads, who wants to cut losses after Blackwater, who reads the newspapers and understands that the world was changing faster than Dutch will ever admit. Where Dutch dreams of grand gestures, Hosea quietly calculates risk, cost, and consequence. That is why his skepticism in St. Denis lands so hard. On those polished streets, surrounded by electric lights and ornate banks, Hosea can see what Dutch refuses to face. The old ways were dying, and civilization is no longer something to rob and outrun, but a machine that grinds up men like them. He warns that they are pushing their luck, that one more big score is not a path to freedom but a fantasy. Dutch calls it a plan. Hosea calls it what it is: a gamble against a stacked world. Then the gamble comes due. During the St. Denis bank job, when the Pinkertons swarm and the illusion of control finally shatters, Hosea is dragged out as leverage. There is a terrible irony here. The man who always tried to keep Dutch out of now-in situations is now the hostage in one. Dutch, the self-styled mastermind, can only watch as Milton presses a gun to Hosea's head. One shot. No speech, no last con, no escape. With Hosea's execution, the gang's emotional center is blown apart in an instant. Afterward, something in Dutch does not just crack, it caves in. He becomes more erratic, more vengeful, less willing to hear dissent from Arthur, John, or anyone else. Without Hosea's voice, there is no one left who can safely say no. No one who can puncture Dutch's growing delusions without being branded a traitor. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, suddenly loses its only reliable witness. Hosea's death is not merely the loss of a friend. It is the removal of Dutch's last internal break, the final barrier between wounded idealist and unrestrained tyrant. From that moment on, every plan grows bloodier, every justification thinner, and every challenge more dangerous. The conscience has been silenced. What happens when a man like Dutch no longer has anyone to save him from himself? Without Hosea, Dutch loses the one man who could gently steer him away from the edge. At the very same time, another pressure builds inside the camp, quieter than gunfire, but far more dangerous to Dutch's sense of control. John Marston's desire to leave. From the very beginning, John and Abigail are not symbols or speeches, but flesh and blood reminders of what this family could have been. They enter the gang as two more outlaws, two more hungry mouths at the fire, bound to Dutch's philosophy of freedom through crime. But when Jack is born, the rhythm changes. Abigail, who has survived brothels, drunks, and the worst the world can offer, begins asking for something Dutch never planned for. Not a bigger score. A safer life. In the early years, Dutch can pretend it is all one story of liberation. Rob the rich, mock civilization, raise the boy under the open sky. Family and outlaw life appear to coexist. Yet as Jack grows, Abigail's questions grow with him. Where will he go to school? How long can the gang keep running? How many bodies must pile up before this child is pulled under with them? Her pleas turn the campfire from a place of simple camaraderie into a quiet courtroom, where Dutch's grand speeches about freedom are suddenly cross-examined by a mother's fear. John feels that pressure most of all. Once, he is the living embodiment of Dutch's dream, a lost soul taken in, trained, given purpose. Over time, that purpose shifts. After Blackwater, after seeing Hosea die in Saint Denis, John's priorities harden into something painfully ordinary. He wants to live long enough to raise Jack somewhere that bullets are not a bedtime story. The old ways were dying, and John, almost alone among them, begins to accept that this might be a mercy. For Dutch, that acceptance is unforgivable. John's distance is not read as exhaustion or growth, but as betrayal. When John disappears for a time before Coulter, Dutch never truly lets it go. Every hesitation, every argument with Abigail becomes evidence that John is abandoning the family. Dutch refuses to see that wanting a different life does not erase the years of belief, the robberies, the blood spilled in his name. In his mind, loyalty is eternal, or it never existed at all. So Dutch weaponizes that loyalty. In camp arguments, he turns John's doubts into accusations. No one leaves until the plan is complete. No one questions the man with the plan. Family, in the truest sense, becomes a chain rather than a refuge. Abigail's demands for stability are dismissed as nagging. John's wish for a ranch and a quiet horizon is framed as cowardice, and even Arthur's growing sympathy is treated as contamination. The irony is brutal. The man who preached freedom now insists his sons can never be free of him. When John finally decides to walk away, Arthur does not stop him. He quietly supports the choice, seeing in John's retreat a chance at the peace he himself may never have. Dutch's reaction is fury, disbelief, a wounded howl that echoes through every later confrontation. If his boys can choose a life without him, what does that say about the grand design he has sacrificed so much for? That unanswered question will haunt every step toward the gang's final, bloody unraveling. That wounded howl does not fade. It echoes into the strange quiet that follows, into the days when John Marston simply vanishes from the world of the Linde gang. John is badly wounded during the escape from the mountains, thrown from his horse and left half frozen and half dead in the snow. After Coulter, after the chaos, he is just gone. No body, no grave, no ransom note, only absence. In a story of outlaws who live and die by reputation, that silence becomes its own accusation. Around the campfires at Horseshoe Overlook, the questions multiply. Did John die out there? Was he taken by O'Driscolls or Pinkertons? Or did he simply walk away from Dutch's grand design? Different voices answer in different ways. Abigail vacillates between fury and terror, convinced in one breath that John has abandoned his family, and in the next that he is lying in some ditch. Forgotten, Javier, who once rode with John as a brother, mutters that a man who disappears without a word cannot be trusted. Bill, always eager to mirror Dutch, starts repeating that John never had the stomach for real hardship. The gang, from its humble beginnings, had survived on shared myth. Now that myth begins to fracture around a missing man. Into that uncertainty steps Dutch, calm at first, then increasingly brittle. He frames John's absence not as tragedy, but as betrayal. He tells the camp that John ran when things became difficult, that some men only want the rewards of freedom without the responsibilities of family. He calls John unreliable, a deserter, the living embodiment of what happens when loyalty wavers. Each sentence is a small revision of history, a quiet verdict delivered before the facts are known. The world was changing, and Dutch's philosophy was changing with it. To admit that John might be dead because Dutch pushed the gang too far, too fast, would wound his ego in the truest sense. So the story shifts. The failed rescue becomes John's cowardice. The missing days become proof that Dutch's doubts were always right. When John finally staggers back, scarred and exhausted, speaking of wolves and blizzards and the simple will to live, the contrast is stark. His ordeal exposes how far Dutch has already drifted into delusions that protect only himself. Arthur stands at the center of this tension. He hears Dutch's speeches, feels the camp leaning toward the new narrative, yet remembers the boy John once was. The lost soul Dutch dragged in from the streets. Arthur wants to believe Dutch. He has built his entire life on that faith. But John's gaunt face and quiet anger do not match the image of a man who simply ran. Each discrepancy, each half-truth, pushes Arthur closer to the realization that Dutch is not just mistaken, he is shaping reality to fit his wounded pride. By the time those missing days are over, Dutch has discovered something dangerous. If he can control the story of who is loyal and who is a traitor, he can control the gang itself. That need to command the narrative, to rewrite every doubt as betrayal, is not just strategy. It is the first clear symptom of a mind slipping from leadership into paranoia, from philosophy into tyranny. And once Dutch learns that a story can be more powerful than the truth, the next lie comes easier, and the next betrayal cuts deeper, until one final disappearance will make John's absence look almost merciful. But for Dutch, controlling the story is only half the battle. The other half rides in with badges, warrants, and a timetable the gang cannot escape. The Pinkertons do not just hunt outlaws, they arrive as the living embodiment of a new America that has run out of room for men like Dutch van der Linde. From the very beginning, the gang's enemies were personal: Colm O'Driscoll, rival outfits, petty sheriffs who could be outgunned or outwitted. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency is something else entirely. Milton and Ross do not swagger in as classic Western villains. They carry federal authority, telegraphs, railroads, and corporate money at their backs. Their presence makes one thing brutally clear: the world was changing, and the old ways were dying, no matter how loudly Dutch preached about freedom and civilization. Their confrontations become a story of pressure tightening, visit by visit. At Horseshoe Overlook, Milton arrives with polite menace, waving John's old wanted poster and dangling Blackwater in front of Dutch like a noose he can almost feel. Later, at Clemens Point and Shady Bell, the pattern repeats, but sharper. Milton taunts Dutch about the ferry job, about the civilians killed, about how progress does not care for romantic outlaws. Each jab is precise. Each reminder of Blackwater turns Dutch's greatest failure into a recurring specter. On the surface, Dutch responds with theatrical defiance. He mocks the agents, calls them lapdogs of a corrupt civilization, insists that no government can cage men who truly desire freedom. In front of the gang, his speeches swell, more grandiose, more idealistic, as if volume alone can drown out the sound of approaching trains and tightening laws. He fires back with rhetoric because he cannot fire back with artillery. In private, the mask slips. Dutch moves camp faster, takes the gang deeper into swamps and mountains, then into the rotten heart of Beaver Hollow. The robberies grow bolder and more reckless, not less. Why rob a train when a bank in St. Denis will really send a message? Why negotiate when blowing a bridge might buy one more week? The logic is simple. In the truest sense, if the enemy is everywhere, then every act of violence becomes self-defense. That external pressure fuses perfectly with Dutch's internal narrative. He stops seeing himself as a criminal on the run and starts seeing himself as a tragic hero besieged by a hypocritical world. Milton's taunts about Blackwater do not humble him, they harden him. If civilization calls him a monster, then he will be the monster that proves its corruption. Dreams blur into delusions. Every dead agent, every ruined town, becomes proof that the system is afraid of him. And here, a pattern interrupt. For all his talk of history, Dutch begins to argue that history can be outrun. One last job, one last score, one last miracle that will carry the gang over the horizon and away from the Pinkertons, away from railroads and telegraphs, away from time itself. The more the modern world tightens its grip, the deeper Dutch retreats into fantasy, insisting that with enough money and enough blood, they can still escape a future that has already arrived. The question is no longer whether the Pinkertons will catch him. It is how many of his own family he will sacrifice before he accepts that they already have. At Beaver Hollow, that question finally has an answer. The gang is no longer hiding from the world. It is hiding from itself, crammed into a damp cave where Dutch's voice echoes off the stone and his paranoia seeps into every corner of daily life. Morning used to mean coffee, laughter, and plans for the next score. Now it means whispered conversations that stop the moment Dutch walks past. Sudden accusations when he catches a glance held a second too long, and impromptu loyalty tests for men and women who have ridden with him for decades. He demands that people repeat his philosophy back to him, word for word, as if reciting scripture can hold his collapsing dreams together. Those who hesitate, even for a heartbeat, feel his eyes on them. The living embodiment of doubt, in his mind, is no longer the Pinkertons. It is his own family. From its humble beginnings, the gang had been built on trust earned through shared danger. In Beaver Hollow, that trust is replaced by suspicion. Dutch corners Arthur about talking to the Pinkertons, not because of evidence, but because Micah has been whispering poison in his ear. He questions John's disappearances, twisting a wounded man's attempt to reach Abigail and Jack into proof of betrayal. At one point, John's capture is treated less as a tragedy and more as a confirmation of Dutch's gut feeling that John was weak and turning. Facts no longer matter. Gut feelings, fueled by Micah's insinuations, become verdicts. The change is written in Dutch's body before it is spoken in his words. He paces the cave mouth in tight, restless loops, hands clasped behind his back one moment, jabbing the air the next. His eyes, once warm and conspiratorial, are wild and glassy, darting from face to face as if measuring who will run first. He can shift in a breath from resting a gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder, calling him son, to explosive rage when Arthur questions a plan. Affection, then fury, then a chilling, distant calm. In the truest sense, it is a man at war with his own fear, unable to admit that the world was changing faster than his control could keep up. Around him, the gang adjusts. Some, like Bill and Javier, double down on loyalty, parroting Dutch's lines about freedom and civilization, while glancing nervously toward Micah, the new favorite. Others, like Arthur and John, begin to plan their exit in silence, trading looks that say more than any argument. The shared purpose that once made this a story of family against the world dissolves into a grim calculus of survival. Who can be trusted? Who will Dutch turn on next? By Beaver Hollow, Dutch's paranoia is not just a symptom, it is the final stage of his breakdown, when a leader can no longer distinguish enemies from loved ones, when every dissenting voice is branded betrayal. The old ways were dying long before the bullets start flying. The end is not just coming, it has already arrived, and Dutch is the last man in the cave who cannot see it. By the time Dutch is pacing the shadows of Beaver Hollow, another clock has started ticking, one that does not care about plans, Pinkertons, or gold. Arthur Morgan is dying. And that simple, brutal fact turns the gang's tragedy into a story of reckoning, of a man forced to watch the philosophy he was raised on collapse just as his own body begins to fail. The diagnosis comes almost mundanely, in a Saint Denis doctor's office that feels more like the future of civilization than the frontier. Arthur coughs blood, slumps in the street, and the world was changing in that instant. Tuberculosis is not a wound that can be stitched or a bullet that can be dug out. It is a sentence. From its humble beginnings as a nagging cough after collecting Strauss's debts, the illness grows into a constant reminder that time, for Arthur, is now measured in sunsets, not scores. At the very beginning of the game, Arthur lives by Dutch's words: survive, protect the family, trust the man with the plan. After the diagnosis, those priorities begin to invert. Survival becomes secondary to meaning. Loyalty is no longer blind, it becomes a question. What has all this bloodshed been for? What will be left behind when the old ways were dying and the gang is gone? Facing death strips away Arthur's tolerance for Dutch's lies. Once, he would echo Dutch's speeches, reassure the camp that freedom was just one train, one bank, one miracle away. Now he hears the cracks. When Dutch abandons the Indians at the reservation, when he leaves John in Sisika, and then coldly suggests moving on without him, Arthur pushes back, even as Micah hisses in Dutch's ear. Each confrontation costs Arthur standing, costs him safety, but he has passed the point of caring about his place at the fire. Key conversations become battlefields. In Beaver Hollow, Arthur demands to know why Dutch left John to rot, why he let Strauss prey on the weak, why he executed Angelo Bronte in a fit of cruel theater. Dutch responds not with reflection, but with anger and denial, accusing Arthur of betrayal, of weakness, of losing faith. In the truest sense, the roles have reversed. The dying man clings to reality, while the healthy one clings to delusions. Yet illness does not just harden Arthur, it softens him. Knowing his time is short, he looks differently at John and Abigail, at the women in camp who have endured every failed promise, at the people they have terrorized in the name of freedom. He helps John envision a ranch, urges him to get out, apologizes to those he once dismissed. The outlaw, who was once the living embodiment of Dutch's violence, begins to question whether Dutch's freedom is only another cage. Arthur's failing lungs become a moral lens, focusing everything toward a final choice. Will he die as Dutch's loyal soldier, or as the man who finally says no? The answer will decide not only his legacy, but who walks out of Beaver Hollow when the gun smoke clears. Arthur's lungs are failing, but the gang's heart has been failing for much longer. The proof is written not in speeches or plans, but in the graves of those Dutch claims to love. Lenny Summers is the clearest example of that cruel arithmetic. From its humble beginnings, the gang needed young blood, and Lenny seemed like the promise of a better future, smart, idealistic, fiercely loyal, the living embodiment of what Dutch said he wanted to build. In Valentine, in Rhodes, in the saloon at Saint Denis, Lenny laughs, drinks, and dreams of a world beyond the outlaw life, talking of seeing more of civilization, of reading, of possibilities. Dutch sees that light, and he spends it without hesitation. The Saint Denis bank robbery is framed as the plan. The big score that will fix Blackwater, Hosea's doubts, the Pinkertons, everything. Dutch insists, over Hosea's caution and Arthur's unease, that this is their moment. Instead, it becomes a story of chaos and slaughter. Hosea dies as a hostage. The street erupts in gunfire. In the smoke and shouting, Lenny climbs a rooftop to cover the retreat, and a sniper's bullet cuts him down mid-stride. No last words, no farewell. Just a bright young man face down on a Saint Denis rooftop, while Dutch screams about betrayal and fate. Does Dutch stop? Does he question the philosophy that put Lenny there? He does not. Lenny's death is folded into the same refrain: the world was changing, the old ways were dying, the Pinkertons forced his hand. Responsibility dissolves into rhetoric. Then there is Molly O'Shea, another casualty of a collapsing empire. From the very beginning, she is Dutch's lover, paraded and protected as proof that he can be tender, that this is a family and not merely an army. But as the plans fail and the paranoia grows, Dutch's warmth toward her turns to distance, then to contempt. Molly, isolated and drinking, finally snaps at camp, staggering in and screaming that she betrayed him to the Pinkertons. Is it true? Is it a desperate attempt to hurt the man who abandoned her? The story never confirms it. What is confirmed is Dutch's reaction. He does not rush to her, does not plead for calm, does not show the mercy he once preached. He stands back, cold and silent, while Miss Grimshaw shoots Molly through the stomach for her supposed betrayal. A woman who loved him dies in the mud, and Dutch's only real response is to turn away and let the gang believe that treachery, not neglect, killed her. Each of these deaths ripples through camp. Conversations grow quieter. Eyes linger on Dutch a little longer. If Lenny can die for a plan that meant nothing, if Molly can be discarded for breaking under the weight of those dreams and delusions, what is anyone else worth? The gang that once called itself a family now moves in tense, fearful circles around its own leader. Every lost life chips away at the myth of Dutch's guidance. Each grave is another crack in the mask, revealing that his plans are no longer a path to freedom, but a series of lethal delusions that demand more blood with every failure. By Beaver Hollow, Dutch's promises have become a story of echoes. The words are the same, the fire in his speeches still burns, but the meaning has rotted away. Every grave behind them, every failed escape, has turned his famous line into a threat rather than a comfort. I have a plan. One of the last great plans is the train job for the army payroll, the so-called ticket out that Micah whispers into Dutch's ear. From its humble beginnings, the gang robbed trains to strike at the rich and powerful, to thumb their noses at a civilization that had no place for outlaws or dreamers. This time, the target is not a greedy railroad baron or a corrupt magnate. It is the United States government itself. In the truest sense, the very embodiment of the system Dutch claims to hate. On paper, it sounds righteous. In reality, it is desperation dressed up as philosophy. Around the fire, the planning phase plays out like a grim parody of the old days. Dutch paces, eyes bright, promising that this score will finally fund their escape to Tahiti, to Australia, to some nameless horizon where the world was changing a little more slowly. He brushes off Arthur's coughing and doubts, sneers at John's questions about Abigail and Jack, and dismisses concerns about Pinkertons and army patrols. Have they all forgotten who he is? Have they lost their faith? If they just believe, if they just follow orders, this time will be different. The details barely matter to him now. The intel comes through Micah, thin and self-serving. The terrain is poorly scouted. The timing relies on luck rather than careful observation. Once, Hosea would have argued every angle, and Dutch would have listened. Now, with Hosea gone, dissent is treated as betrayal, and caution sounds to Dutch like cowardice. When the train finally appears out of the fog and smoke, the plan collapses almost immediately. Extra guards ride the cars. A patrol appears on the ridge that no one mentioned. The dynamite placement goes wrong, derailing more than intended and trapping civilians in twisted metal. Dutch could call a retreat, cut their losses, and vanish back into the trees. Instead, he doubles down. He orders the gang to push forward, to take hostages, to fire on soldiers and innocents alike rather than admit the job is blown. Arthur and John feel the shift in real time. This is no longer about money or even revenge. Under gunfire, Arthur watches Dutch chase a fleeing officer simply to silence a witness, while John glances back toward the woods, thinking of Abigail and Jack instead of Tahiti. The pattern is undeniable now. Every plan is bigger, bloodier, and more reckless, not to save the family, but to protect Dutch's pride from collapsing. When they finally escape, dragging their wounded through the mud, the take is meager compared to the cost. The gang is smaller. The noose around them is tighter. Dutch, however, talks as if they have inched closer to salvation. Is he lying to them, or only to himself? These late-game heists become trains to nowhere, roaring forward on rusted tracks toward a future that no longer exists. They are not about building a new life, but about outrunning the truth that the old ways were dying, that Dutch's time as a leader, and perhaps his mind, is almost gone. The next plan will only make that clearer. The illusion of one last plan finally shatters on the cliff above Beaver Hollow, where the dream of the Linde gang is reduced to a bundle of cash and a handful of dying men. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and now all of Dutch's grand speeches are compressed into a single brutal choice: gold or souls. The scene begins in chaos. Pinkertons swarm the camp, gunfire echoes through the trees, and the gang, once a story of freedom and family, scatters in terror. Arthur and John fight their way back to the cave, not for glory, but for survival, for the faint hope that something can still be saved. Deep inside, beneath the rocks, lies the hidden money, the Blackwater score that has haunted them from the very beginning. And waiting there are Dutch and Micah, arguing over the same philosophy that has carried them to this cliff's edge. Arthur arrives half-broken, bloodied, coughing, yet still trying to be the conscience Dutch abandoned. He pleads, not as an outlaw, but as a son begging a father to come home. He tells Dutch the truth. Micah is the rat. Micah has been playing them. Micah is dragging the gang toward a grave. Arthur urges him to let go of the money, to walk away, to save John and whoever else can still escape. He calls back to the man Dutch once was, the living embodiment of a wild, idealistic freedom that protected the weak instead of feeding on them. Dutch's face in that moment is a battlefield. He looks at Arthur, at Micah, at the bags of cash, and something almost human flickers behind his eyes. He hesitates, silent, weighing loyalty against betrayal, flesh and blood family against a pile of bills that has already cost Hosea, Lenny, and so many others their lives. For a heartbeat, it seems possible that the old Dutch might step forward, admit he was wrong, and choose his people over his pride. Does he hear Hosea's voice in that pause, or only his own echo? Then he turns, not toward Arthur, but away. Without a word of real comfort, Dutch follows Micah and the money into the storm, leaving Arthur and John to fend for themselves. In the truest sense, this is Dutch's verdict on his own dream. He chooses the symbol over the substance, the fantasy of one last score over the battered men that dream was supposed to shelter. It is a story of dreams and delusions, of a leader who cannot admit that civilization has beaten him. On that cliff, Dutch does not simply lose his mind, he signs its confession. He abandons his surrogate son to cling to a future that no longer exists, proving that the gang's philosophy has rotted into pure self-preservation. And when dawn comes, this choice will return, on another cliff, with a gun in John Marston's hand. What will Dutch choose then? Dawn does not forgive Dutch's choice on that cliff, it exposes it. As the night of Beaver Hollow bleeds into morning, Arthur begins his final ride, and the gang's grand philosophy finally collides with the limits of his failing body. He rides up into the mountains, coughing, bleeding, lungs ruined by tuberculosis and the day's wounds. Every jolt of the horse is a reminder that the world was changing while the gang stood still. Snow and rock blur around him, and the old ways were dying beneath his hooves. This is not a triumphant outlaw charge. It is a slow, painful ascent, a man climbing toward his own ending, reflecting on a story of freedom and family that has curdled into paranoia and betrayal. On that ride, Arthur is in the truest sense the living embodiment of Dutch's dream and its failure. He remembers the campfires, the speeches, the promises that they were different from common thieves. He thinks of Hosea's warnings, of John's bruised loyalty, of the innocents dragged into Dutch's delusions. From its humble beginnings as a ragged band robbing the rich and corrupt, the gang has become exactly what it once claimed to fight. Arthur's last act is not to chase wealth, but to try to drag John and Abigail out from under the ruins. At the summit, the story narrows to three men: Arthur, Micah, and Dutch. The confrontation with Micah is brutal and intimate, two exhausted predators clawing at each other in the dust. Then, Dutch steps from the shadows. In some versions of this tale, he never comes, leaving Arthur to die alone in the storm. But in the version that matters most for Dutch's mind, he arrives in time to see the truth. He hears Micah's desperate lies. He hears Arthur's rasping accusations. He sees the Blackwater money, the betrayals, the bodies behind them. For a moment, the mask slips. Dutch's expression freezes between shock and shame, between the man who once lectured about freedom and the leader who left Hosea to die and Abigail to be tortured. His eyes move from Arthur's ruined face to Micah's bloodied one, and something inside him fractures. Yet he does nothing. He does not help Arthur. He does not kill Micah. He fires once into the rock, turns away, and walks into the fog with his gold and his ghosts. That refusal is his verdict on everything he ever claimed to believe. Arthur's death seals it. Whether he dies watching the sunrise, finally at peace as the light washes over a world that no longer has room for men like him, or is beaten and stabbed in the mud by Micah, the moral end is the same. The original van der Linde dream dies on that ridge. The philosophy is finished. All that remains for Dutch is guilt, legend, and a cache of useless money. Dutch never gets closure with his surrogate son. There is no apology, no reckoning, no final conversation about what their family was supposed to mean. He walks away and carries that unresolved betrayal into the empty. Unseen years between games. A lost soul wandering the edges of a civilization he once swore he would never bow to. The next time his path crosses a Marston on a cliff, that unfinished morning with Arthur will be standing there too, waiting for an answer. From that cliff in the mountains to the cliff above the San Luis River, there is an 8-year silence. Arthur dies in 1899. John reappears in Dutch's world in 1907. Between those dates, the camera looks away. Yet the story of Dutch's breakdown does not stop. It simply moves off stage into rumors, half-remembered names, and the frightened respect whispered around campfires. The world was changing, and Dutch knew it. The government that had chased the van der Linde gang through the heartlands now spread telegraph lines, railroads, and military patrols deeper into the frontier. In Red Dead Redemption, agents talk about Dutch as an ongoing problem, a bandit philosopher turned regional menace, a man who refuses to vanish with the old ways. That alone reveals something crucial. He does not retire. He doubles down. From its humble beginnings as a roaming family of thieves and dreamers, Dutch's operation contracts and fractures. The big caravan camps are gone. In their place are scattered cells, smaller gangs under his influence, young outlaws drawn in by tales of the legendary Dutch van der Linde. He recruits the desperate and the impressionable, men and women who never knew Hosea's dry wisdom or Arthur's quiet doubts, only the myth of a leader who robbed from the rich and defied civilization. Those years leave fingerprints in dialogue. Lawmen mention Dutch working with or manipulating native tribes in the mountains, using their anger and dispossession as fuel for his private war against the government. What began as sympathy for the oppressed in RDR2 hardens into something colder. He arms them, directs them, and lets them bleed for his cause. The rhetoric is still about freedom and injustice, but the people have become pieces on a board. Here the absence of his original family matters more than any single gunfight. With Hosea gone, there is no one to question the feasibility of a plan. Without Arthur, there is no one to quietly pull Dutch back from the edge or remind him what their family once tried to be. Bill and Javier carry memories, but not the moral weight to confront him. Micah's poison lingers in Dutch's ear even after Micah is dead. That voice of flattery and cruelty has already done its work. In the truest sense, these 8 years are where Dutch's philosophy finishes rotting. The speeches become more polished, more abstract, more detached from the terrified teenagers and displaced warriors standing in front of him. He repeats the same lines about breaking free of civilization, about one last stand against a corrupt world, yet his concern for individual lives thins with every season. Freedom becomes an excuse, not a promise. By the time John finds him again, Dutch is the living embodiment of his own myth. His new followers see a prophet, not a man, a legend, not a leader who once burned coffee over a campfire and argued about books with Hosea. His gang in Red Dead Redemption is the ghost of the van der Linde family, a hollow echo of the original dream, marching toward a final stand with a leader who has become more story than human. The question is, what happens when that myth finally runs out of land to run to? That myth does not ride alone. When Dutch reappears in Red Dead Redemption, he has surrounded himself with a new generation of believers, young outlaws with bandanas over their faces, and hardened native fighters pushed to the edge of extinction by an advancing civilization. To them, Dutch is not a broken man from a failed family. He is the living embodiment of resistance. These followers come from the margins of a world that has no place for them. Dispossessed native warriors, clinging to the last fragments of their land and honor, desperate boys with rifles, chasing stories of glory because there is no honest work that will feed them. They whisper Dutch's name as legend, not as memory, because they never saw him around a campfire, laughing with Hosea, or comforting a sick Arthur. They only see the prophet on the hill, the outlaw who promises that the old ways were dying, but that he knows how to keep freedom alive. Dutch, in turn, gives them exactly what they are hungry for. The speeches return, almost word for word from their humble beginnings, tirades against government oppression, banks, railroads, and the lie of progress. He still talks about family, about loyalty, about a philosophy that rejects the cages of civilization. But the context has curdled. Where once those words launched precise robberies and carefully chosen targets, now they are used to justify raids that are essentially suicidal. He sends them charging at fortified positions, into Gatling gunfire, against armies that cannot be beaten. Dutch stands back, often watching through binoculars, directing chaos rather than sharing it. The man who once rode at the front now lingers at the rear, stepping in only when the outcome is clear or escape is guaranteed. These people are not family in the truest sense. They are ammunition. The contrast with the original gang is brutal. Arthur, John, Charles, Sadie, even Bill and Javier were allowed to question him, to argue, to walk away from a doomed plan. These new recruits do not know the man well enough to doubt him. They only know the legend, and legends do not get second-guessed. Dutch exploits that ignorance, sending a story of freedom to die in places he will not. In doing so, he becomes exactly what he once hated, a man in power, using grand ideas to push the vulnerable into graves for a cause that has narrowed from revolution to personal vendetta. It is a story of loyalty twisted into obedience, of dreams hardened into delusions, of a leader who cannot accept that the world was changing without him. This is not a new beginning for Dutch van der Linde. It is his final, hollow performance. A last act where he can no longer tell the difference between the legend he built and the reality bleeding out at his feet. That hollow performance in the mountains gives way, in Red Dead Redemption, to a cruel irony. The man who once followed Dutch into the fire becomes the hound sent to drag him out of his final hiding places. The mentor who preached freedom from the state is now hunted on behalf of that same state. In the truest sense, the roles have reversed. John Marston's life, by 1911, is no longer his own. Federal agents Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham hold his past over his head, using his outlaw history as a leash. His family is taken, his ranch is watched, and every promise of peace is conditioned on one task: dismantle what remains of the van der Linde legacy. First Bill Williamson in New Austin, then Javier Escuella in Mexico, and finally Dutch himself in the mountains of West Elizabeth. From its humble beginnings as a gang built on choice and camaraderie, the story has become a chain of coercion. For John, each name on that list carries weight, but Dutch is different. This is the man who once pulled him off the streets, who called him son, who spoke of a world where men could live beyond the reach of civilization. Now that same figure is a target dossier, reduced to a bounty and a set of coordinates. The long-standing tension between John's desire for family and Dutch's restless philosophy is no longer an argument around a campfire. It is a life-or-death pursuit across snowfields and cliff edges. How does a man reconcile hunting the person who taught him what loyalty even meant? Dutch understands exactly what has happened. When John finally corners him in Cochine, Dutch does not plead. He taunts. He asks who the real traitor is, the aging revolutionary still fighting the system, or the former outlaw now riding for the government's gunmen. He frames John as the living embodiment of everything they once swore to resist, insisting that John has sold his soul to the very machine that killed their dreams. In Dutch's mind, John is not a savior of his family. He is proof that the old ways were dying. Yet beneath the contempt, there is something more complicated. In several confrontations, Dutch's words carry a strange, almost paternal pride. He acknowledges John's persistence, his refusal to back down, his willingness to walk into impossible odds for those he loves. Is that not, in a twisted way, the product of Dutch's own teaching? The strong son who survived, even if survival means becoming his executioner. Their final showdown is not just a gunfight on a cliff. It is a story of love curdled into resentment, of shared dreams rotted by betrayal, of two men who once wanted the same freedom and now stand on opposite sides of civilization's barrel. Dutch chooses his own end, stepping backward into the ravine rather than letting the government claim him, leaving John with an answer and a question. The answer is that Dutch will never belong to the New World. The question is whether John ever truly escaped him. Because Dutch's body falls, but his shadow does not. And in the next moments, that shadow will come home to Beecher's Hope. Dutch's body vanishes into the ravine, but his voice lingers. Because just before that fall, on that narrow cliff above the government's rifles, Dutch van der Linde delivers his last sermon, a final attempt to turn his own downfall into a story of principle rather than defeat. He is wounded, exhausted, cornered, below Ross and the agent's weight, the living embodiment of the new order that has been hunting him since the very beginning. Above, there is only empty sky and a sheer drop. Dutch stands between those two worlds, swaying on his feet, facing John Marston one last time, and yet he still speaks as if he is the one holding court. He tells John that the government will just find another monster, that they'll just find someone else to blame. He calls them the future, says they will come for men like John too, warns that progress is a machine that consumes outlaws and lawmen alike. In that moment, Dutch frames himself as a tragic hero standing against an inevitable tide, a man too wild, too free, for this new civilization. The world was changing, and he wants history to see him as a casualty of that change, not the architect of his own ruin. Listen to the echoes. His words about government corruption, about the death of freedom, are stripped-down versions of the speeches he gave in RDR2 around campfires and after robberies. Then he spoke of family, of protecting the weak, of building a better life from its humble beginnings in the mud and the snow. Now, there is no mention of Arthur, no mention of Hosea, no mention of the people he once called his children, only a lonely outlaw railing against them, against progress, against a faceless civilization that he insists is worse than anything he ever did. This is Dutch's philosophy at its most condensed and most hollow. The same rhetoric of freedom and resistance, but emptied of loyalty, emptied of responsibility, emptied of love. A story of ideals and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a man who cannot admit that the worst betrayals were his own. When he looks at John and says, "Our time is past," John, it is both confession and accusation. Dutch knows the old ways were dying. He has known it since Blackwater. But instead of accepting that death with humility, he turns even this into theater. He will not give Ross the satisfaction of a capture, nor John the closure of a clean kill. So he steps back, choosing the void. That jump is his last act of control. If he cannot win, he will at least choose how he loses. In the truest sense, Dutch dies as he lived, refusing to let the world define him, even as it buries him. But does he truly believe the words he throws at John in those final seconds? Or is he preaching to himself, desperate to believe his life was more than a trail of broken people. That question hangs in the air as John rides home, and Dutch's shadow rides with him. Dutch's shadow does not end at that cliff. It stretches backward through every campfire speech, every broken promise, every body left in the dust. To understand when he truly breaks, the story must be walked in reverse, from its humble beginnings to its bitter end, tracing the exact moments when a revolutionary becomes the tyrant he always claimed to oppose. From the very beginning, Dutch presents himself as the living embodiment of resistance, an idealistic outlaw railing against civilization, preaching freedom, family, and a flexible philosophy of taking from the rich and corrupt. Yet Blackwater is the first fracture that never really heals. A botched ferry, dead innocence, a failed escape. Dutch survives, but something essential in him does not. From then on, every one last score carries the weight of that unseen disaster, turning dreams into obsession. Guarma deepens the wound. Stranded on a foreign island, stripped of context and control, Dutch's rhetoric soars higher even as his judgment sinks lower. He abandons workers he promised to help, lies more easily, and learns how intoxicating it is to command desperate men in a lawless world. When he returns, he is not the same leader who left Shady Belle. The old ways were dying, and Dutch decides he would rather rule the ruins than adapt. Hosea's death and Bronte's murder mark another threshold. Hosea was the conscience, the quiet reminder that the gang was a family first and a weapon second. When Hosea burns on the Saint Denis gallows, Dutch loses his last true equal. Moments later, dragging Angelo Bronte from a party into the mud, then drowning him in front of horrified followers, Dutch crosses from theatrical outlaw to casual executioner. Some argue that is the point of no return. Others point to Beaver Hollow, where paranoia becomes policy. Dutch starves the camp, trusts Micah over Arthur, leaves John to die, and lets an O'Driscoll hang just to make a point. By the time he stands on that cliff with the money, choosing gold and pride over Arthur's hand, many see not a broken man, but a fully formed villain. Yet there is another reading, that Dutch was always a ticking time bomb. The same ego, certainty, and charisma that inspired loyalty also made dissent intolerable. In the truest sense, his fall is simply those traits turned inward, his philosophy curdling under pressure. Or was he, at least once, a decent man driven mad by loss, Blackwater, Hosea, Arthur's defiance, a tragic figure crushed as the world was changing around him? Perhaps both are true. Dutch van der Linde becomes a story of freedom and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a lost soul who was at once victim and perpetrator. Shaped by his time, yet still the architect of his own destruction. That duality is not just Dutch's tragedy, it is the tragedy of the country around him. From the very beginning, Rockstar frames the van der Linde gang as more than a band of outlaws. They are a miniature America at the turn of the century, a story of high ideals and bloody methods, of a nation that preaches freedom and equality while riding on stolen land and broken promises. Dutch speaks of liberty, of the individual against the crushing weight of civilization, and the camp nods along. On paper, his philosophy sounds almost noble: live free, answer to no king, protect the weak from the powerful. But look closer at how that freedom is funded. Robbed trains, looted banks, dead lawmen, and terrified civilians are the quiet footnotes beneath every rousing speech. In the truest sense, the gang becomes the living embodiment of a country that tells itself one story and lives another. This tension runs straight through Dutch's rhetoric, which echoes the old frontier myths that built American identity. He casts himself as the lone hero resisting government overreach, the last honest man in a corrupt world of rail barons and politicians. The wilderness, to him, is not just scenery, it is a moral refuge, a place where a man can reinvent himself beyond the law. Is that not the same dream that sent countless settlers west, chasing a horizon that always seemed just out of reach? But the world was changing. Railroads carved steel across the plains, oil derricks stab at the sky, and federal agents arrive with telegraphs, warrants, and ledgers. Each new camp the gang establishes, Horseshoe Overlook under the shadow of trains, Clemens Point beside industrial docks, Shady Belle near the smoke of Saint Denis, marks another step in the closing of the frontier. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's plans grow more frantic as that reality tightens around him. Rockstar mirrors the historical end of the outlaw era with ruthless precision. Cornwall's private army functions like a corporate militia. The Pinkertons operate as the long arm of federal law, and even the native reservations show the aftermath of a civilization that has already chosen progress over people. Dutch claims to be fighting for those trampled by this march of time, yet his choices repeatedly endanger them. How many innocents die so he can cling to his own legend? In this light, Dutch's breakdown becomes more than a personal collapse. It is the psychological crisis of a nation refusing to admit its myths no longer match its reality. He keeps insisting that one last score will restore the dream, that one more victory will prove he was right all along, even as his family starves, fractures, and falls. That is the cruel irony. The more he clings to the story of righteous rebellion, the more he betrays the very people that story was meant to protect. By the time Dutch is cornered on those cliffs in the first Red Dead Redemption, he is not just an aging outlaw. He is the dying echo of an entire way of life, a lost soul who cannot live in the new world, yet refuses to let the old one go. His fall is America's myth, cracking under its own weight, and the next phase of his descent will show how that crack becomes an abyss. Loyalty is the currency of the Linde gang, and Dutch spends it recklessly. From the very beginning, membership is not just a matter of sharing a campfire or splitting a score. It is a vow. Follow Dutch's orders. Risk everything for the gang. Believe in the dream, even when that dream begins to hurt. In the truest sense, Dutch defines loyalty as faith in his philosophy. His speeches about freedom, about resisting civilization and the government, turn robbery into a cause and turn frightened drifters into believers. Riding into a job with him means trusting that the plan serves something bigger than greed. When Arthur charges a Pinkerton line, when John stands beside Dutch in Saint Denis, they are not only protecting a man, they are protecting the idea that this outlaw family is the living embodiment of a better world. But loyalty in this story of dreams and delusions is a test that never ends. Each failed plan, each dead comrade, becomes another moment where the gang must decide whether to keep believing. After Blackwater, after Hosea and Lenny fall in Saint Denis, Dutch responds not with humility, but with demands. Trust me. Have faith. One more score. The more the world was changing around him, the more he insists that loyalty means silence, obedience, and unquestioning devotion. That is where betrayal begins. Not with Micah whispering to the Pinkertons in some shadowed corner, but with Dutch betraying his own code. The man who once spared hostages on a train now orders executions without blinking. The leader who promised never to leave a gang member behind abandons Arthur on the mountain and walks away from John at Beaver Hollow. He weaponizes loyalty, turning it from a bond into a leash, accusing anyone who questions him of treason against the family. For Arthur, John, Sadie, and Abigail, the cost of that twisted loyalty is agony. Arthur's entire life has been built around Dutch's approval. Turning away from him feels like tearing out his own heart. John, desperate to give Jack a future beyond blood and bullets, must choose between the man who raised him and the son who needs him. Abigail, who has watched campfire stories turn into gunfire and graves, refuses to let her child be sacrificed to another plan. Sadie, forged in loss, stays loyal to the people she loves, not the banner Dutch flies, and that distinction nearly gets her killed. The game makes that struggle personal. Missions begin with faith in Dutch's vision and end with the sick realization that following orders might be feeding a delusion. How long can loyalty excuse cruelty? At what point does riding with Dutch become complicity rather than camaraderie? From its humble beginnings as a band of idealistic outlaws, the Linde gang becomes a cautionary tale about devotion gone blind. When loyalty to a person or a dream outruns loyalty to a moral compass, family turns into a prison and belief becomes a weapon. The tragedy is that the gang learns this truth too late, and the next fracture in Dutch's circle will prove just how deadly that lesson can be. That fracture begins with a dangerous question lingering under every campfire speech Dutch gives. What if he actually has a point? His philosophy is not born from madness in the very beginning, but from watching a world where the poor are crushed under boots and the powerful carve up the land. A story of freedom and family, of dreams and delusions, begins with a man staring at civilization and seeing only chains. Dutch's main arguments are simple, almost seductive. Government and industry, in his eyes, do not protect the individual, they domesticate and exploit. Railroads cut through sacred ground, oil derricks poison the horizon, and men like Leviticus Cornwall buy politicians the way they buy bullets. The poor, the desperate, the outcast are pushed to the margins, then punished for trying to survive. In the truest sense, Dutch believes that within this system, true freedom is impossible. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. The games make that painfully clear. Corrupt lawmen in Valentine and Saint Denis enforce order for the highest bidder. Cornwall's private army hunts the gang harder than any sheriff, not for justice, but for profit. Native people are lied to, displaced, and finally betrayed at Beaver Hollow, when Dutch uses Rainsfall's cause as leverage for his own schemes. The slums of Saint Denis, the factory smoke over Annisburg, the chain gangs on the roadside, all testify that Dutch is not imagining the cruelty of civilization. For a time, he even seems the living embodiment of resistance. He spares hostages on the early train job, talks about robbing from the rich, and insists the gang is a family, not just an outlaw band. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang carries a rough, idealistic code: hurt those who deserve it, protect those who do not. That is the dream Arthur and John sign up for. But the methods tell a different story. Robbery becomes massacre. Revolution becomes ego. Dutch manipulates the vulnerable, from Arthur's loyalty to John's need for approval, and he sacrifices the very people he claims to fight for. He feeds Angelo Bronte to the alligators, abandons the Wapiti when the plan fails, and leaves John to die on the Saint Denis rooftops. Is that freedom? Or just another tyrant choosing who lives and who dies? The games force the player into this tension. The ugliness of civilization is undeniable, yet Dutch's freedom leaves towns burned, innocents terrorized, and his own family shattered. By the time he guns down an O'Driscoll prisoner in cold blood, the line between resistance and cruelty has vanished. Dutch's tragedy is not that he is wrong about everything. It is that he takes the pieces he is right about and uses them to justify everything else. And the next time he says, "I have a plan," that justification will drag the gang somewhere far darker than robbery or rebellion. Dutch's mantra has curdled, but its echo does not vanish. It fractures, and those fragments lodge in the men who once rode beside him. The story of Dutch's breakdown is not complete without the story of what Arthur and John do with the ruins of that dream. Arthur's path begins in the very beginning as the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. He is the true believer, the loyal son who defends Dutch in every argument, parrots his speeches about freedom and civilization, and shoulders the worst of the gang's violence in the name of a better future. From its humble beginnings in campfire councils to the desperate flight after Blackwater, Arthur is the one who keeps the wheels turning while Dutch talks about progress and destiny. But the world was changing, and Arthur changes with it. Hosea's death, Lenny's death, the hanging of innocents in Rhodes, the massacre in Saint Denis, each moment chips away at that faith. When Dutch leaves John to die on the refinery rooftops, when he abandons Arthur in the chaos of Guarma, when he ignores a starving camp to chase Tahiti in revenge, the spell finally breaks. Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis snaps the last chain. Time becomes short. Excuses no longer work. In the truest sense, Arthur's final chapters are a story of amends. He shields John and Abigail, warns the gang about Micah, and risks everything to rescue the Marstons from Dutch's collapsing empire. On that last ride up the mountain, coughing blood and facing down Pinkertons and traitors, he dies not for Dutch's plan, but to save others from the man he once worshipped. John's road runs beside Arthur's, but never quite in step. John is the skeptic in a camp of believers, the outlaw who always has one boot pointed toward the door. He runs off for a year before Blackwater, chafes at Dutch's authority, and questions the endless promises of one last score. His loyalty is to Abigail and Jack more than to the grand philosophy Dutch keeps preaching. When the gang finally implodes, John does what Dutch always claimed to want, but never chose. He walks away. He builds a ranch, a family, a quiet life under the shadow of government agents and barbed wire. And then the system Dutch warned him about drags him back, forcing him to hunt the very man who once called him son. Both men carry Dutch with them. Arthur keeps the compassion, the sense of justice for the poor and powerless that existed before the delusions took over. John keeps the stubborn independence, the refusal to be fully owned by any government, gang, or civilization. Yet both reject Dutch in decisive ways. Arthur by standing between Dutch and the vulnerable, John by choosing a simple home over outlaw glory, even when it costs him everything. Together, they become two answers to the same question. When a dream like Dutch's dies, what comes next? Try to redeem it in small, human acts, or turn away and build something entirely new. The tragedy is that neither path escapes the consequences of the man who dreamed it first. And Dutch himself? His answer will be far darker. Dutch's answer is not only darker, it is louder, longer, and endlessly retold. Long after the last shot echoes off those dying hills, what remains is not the man in the truest sense, but the stories built around him. Each one a mirror held at a different angle. For Arthur, Dutch is remembered in fragments: the mentor who taught him to read, the outlaw philosopher who spoke of freedom and civilization, and the trembling gunman who left a man to drown in the mud at Beaver Hollow. His journal swings between reverence and disgust, between gratitude for a father and horror at a stranger. John's memory is harsher, edged with betrayal. He remembers being left to rot after being captured, remembers Dutch turning his back on Abigail and Jack, remembers that final moment on the cliff in Red Dead Redemption when the man who once promised family now chooses the fall over any confession. Others carry their own versions. Javier clings to the idealistic revolutionary, the man who promised that the world was changing and that they would ride ahead of it. Bill remembers the commander who gave his violence purpose. Sadie remembers the leader who finally armed her grief. Even Micah, in his sneering way, remembers an opportunity, a fading legend he could ride to his own advantage. Each memory is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, edited by where each person stepped off Dutch's sinking ship and what they needed to believe to live with themselves. Beyond the campfire, the wider world turns Dutch into something flatter and easier to sell. Newspapers in St. Denis and Blackwater speak of the Van der Linde gang as a plague, a rolling disaster of robbery and murder. Wanted posters reduce complex lives to a sketch, a bounty, and a warning line about being armed and dangerous. Rumors in Valentine saloons turn Hosea into a trickster devil, Arthur into a nameless gun hand, Dutch into the living embodiment of outlaw chaos. From its humble beginnings as a ragged family with a philosophy, the gang becomes a campfire ghost story told to frighten children and reassure adults that civilization is winning. Players enter this world of half-truths and take a side in the myth-making. Debates rage over whether Dutch was ever truly good, whether his love for Arthur and John was genuine or only useful, whether Blackwater broke him or simply revealed what was there from the very beginning. Is he a man crushed by the old ways we're dying, or a lost soul who used ideals to excuse his appetites? Every interpretation is another layer of legend, another attempt to pin down a man who refused to stand still. Because Dutch himself is above all a storyteller. He narrates his life as a grand epic, insists there is always a plan, always a chapter yet to be written, even as reality shreds his script. Guarma, Tahiti, The Last Big Score, each is a new act in a drama only he can see. He quotes philosophy while drowning in paranoia, preaches family while sacrificing family, speaks of freedom while marching his people into cages and graves. In the end, Dutch gets what he always wanted. He becomes a legend, but not the Robin Hood of his own imagination, rather. A cautionary tale whispered in saloons. A name that makes lawmen tighten their grips and old gang members stare into the fire a little too long. The cost of that legend, Hosea's quiet wisdom, Arthur's final ride, John's blood on a farmhouse floor, can never be fully tallied. And yet, Dutch's story is not finished. Because one question still hangs over every retelling: what if he had chosen differently? That question hangs over every frame of Dutch's life, from its humble beginnings to its bloody end. Because his story is not just a fall from grace, it is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a man who could not accept that the world was changing. From the very beginning, Dutch appears in laughter, a young outlaw trading schemes with Hosea on a dusty road, two conmen trying to rob each other, and ending up toasting to a shared philosophy instead. In that moment is almost pure idealism, railing against civilization, preaching freedom from government and industry, promising a family that would live by its own code. Arthur is brought into that orbit as a boy, then John, and Dutch becomes, in the truest sense, a father of a found family. The frames darken after Blackwater. The ferry job goes wrong off-screen, but its ghosts haunt every camp that follows. Dutch's invincible legend dies there, replaced by a man chasing one last score to make sense of so much loss. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, he still talks about justice and revenge, still spares hostages when it suits the story he tells himself. But the cracks are visible in the glassy stare, the distracted pacing, the way every plan sounds a little more desperate than the last. Hosea's death in Saint Denis is the shattering blow. The living embodiment of Dutch's conscience is gunned down while Dutch watches, powerless. From that moment, Guarma's pressure cooker strips away the charm and leaves raw nerves. Dutch stops listening, starts dictating, and in the humid jungle air, Micah moves in to fill the void Hosea left. The trusted partner becomes a whispering sycophant, feeding Dutch's paranoia, promising that only violence and secrecy can save the gang. By Beaver Hollow, the transformation is nearly complete. The cave is a visual echo of his mind, dark, cramped, echoing with fear. Dutch speaks of betrayal so often that loyalty loses all meaning. He lifts Arthur up with one hand, calling him son, then lets him fall, refusing to hear his warnings about Micah or the sickness rotting the camp. He fails John and Abigail, leaving John to rot in Sisika, striking Abigail in a moment of rage, choosing the gang's myth over their lives. And yet, on that final cliff, another frame is added. Years later, an aging revolutionary stands over Micah and John, coat whipping in the wind, and silently chooses. He kills Micah, then walks away from John just as he once walked away from Arthur. Freedom has become obsession, family has become collateral, and the dream of a better world has collapsed under one man's ego and fear. What does that make Dutch in the larger Red Dead saga? Visionary, villain, or just another lost soul crushed between the old ways that were dying and the civilization rising to replace them? The answer lies in what his gang and his legend reveal about the stories people tell to live with what they have done. In the larger Red Dead saga, Dutch's breakdown does not end with his fall from that cliff. It echoes forward, reshaping lives and rewriting destinies long after his body hits the rocks below. His story becomes a fault line in the West itself, a story of one man's philosophy rippling out through those who survived him. No one feels that more than John Marston. From the very beginning, Dutch's decision to mold John into a surrogate son places a target on the boy's back. The gang's escalating violence, Dutch's war with civilization, and his refusal to compromise draw the attention of a government that is learning how to hunt outlaws with files and telegraphs instead of posses and wanted posters. By the time of Red Dead Redemption, the Bureau does not just want Dutch, it wants the remnants of his world. And John is the perfect instrument, loyal enough to track his former family, desperate enough to do it for his own. Dutch's choices box John in. The Blackwater disaster, the dead agents, the headlines about the Linde gang turned Dutch from local menace into federal priority. Years later, John is dragged from his ranch, forced to hunt Bill, Javier, and finally Dutch himself, erasing the gang one bullet at a time. When John makes his last stand at Beecher's Hope, facing rows of rifles on his own front porch, it is Dutch's death scene rewritten in miniature, not on a cliff above a river, but in a barn doorway, a domestic echo of the same doomed resistance. Sadie Adler's path is another fragment of Dutch's legacy. Found in the ruins of her burned homestead, a grieving widow turned feral by loss, she is pulled into Dutch's orbit and taught to survive in a world that has already taken everything from her. Under his banner, and under Arthur's quieter guidance, she learns to shoot, to ride, to track. She also learns that loyalty can be rewarded with betrayal, and that grand speeches about freedom often end with someone bleeding in the mud. By the epilogue, she has become the living embodiment of Dutch's world, hardened, efficient, unable to go back to an ordinary life, carrying both the skills and the scars that his philosophy carved into her. Around them, the world was changing. The outlaw era closes almost imperceptibly at first. Railroads knit the map together, telephones and typewriters turn rumors into records, and the government consolidates power in ways Dutch always feared. The old ways were dying, and men like Dutch are transformed from threats into stories. From its humble beginnings, as whispered tales around campfires to sensational dime novels sold at train stations. The real blood and grief are flattened into legend. Yet Dutch's rhetoric does not vanish with him. It lingers in smaller, stubborn forms, in Jack Marston's quiet resentment of the government that murdered his father, in his decision to study the law yet still hunt down Edgar Ross with an outlaw's resolve, in the romanticization of men who would not be tamed that runs through the popular culture of the new century. His words about freedom and corruption become part of the myth of the West, even as the civilization he hated paves over his grave. In the truest sense, Dutch van der Linde becomes more than a character in a game. He stands as a symbol of doomed resistance, a man whose idealistic dreams inspire loyalty, whose delusions justify cruelty, and whose downfall consumes those who believed in him. The question that remains is simple and terrible. When resistance turns into obsession, how many lives does one man's story get to rewrite before the cost becomes unforgivable? That question lingers because Dutch's story is not just about a mad outlaw dragging a gang to ruin. It is a story of recognizing a face that once meant safety and realizing, too late, that it has become dangerous. In the truest sense, it is about loving someone who is not what they were believed to be, and feeling the ground shift when that truth finally lands. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang presents Dutch as the living embodiment of freedom and defiance. Arthur, Hosea, John, and the rest gather around his fire, listen to his speeches about civilization choking the world, and laugh when he mocks the tyranny of railroads and banks. The games invite the player into that circle. They ride beside Dutch on jobs, watch him tease Bill, hear him praise Arthur as his son. Trust is built, slowly, deliberately, then that trust is used. Not suddenly, not with a single heel turn, but a frame-by-frame erosion. Dutch walks away from Arthur in the mud at Valentine. Dutch leaves John to die on the train. Dutch raises his gun and shoots the woman in the trolley station after Bronte's kidnapping. The same voice that once promised a better world now just says, "I have a plan," and expects obedience. The player is not just observing this shift, the player is acting within it, helping rob Cornwall's train, storm Bronte's manor, flee St. Denis under a hail of bullets, all under Dutch's banner. There is a quiet horror in that complicity. How many times does a campfire speech excuse a cruel decision? How many times does loyalty to the man overwrite loyalty to the truth? The games force a question that reaches beyond the screen. How often, in ordinary life, do people cling to an image of someone long after their actions have disproved it? Beneath the gunfights, there is tenderness that makes the fall unbearable. Dutch sitting with Jack, reading adventure stories. Dutch and Hosea trading old jokes in the snow, two aging dreamers pretending the world was not changing. Dutch resting a hand on Arthur's shoulder after Colm's failed hanging, voice soft, promising that the family will endure. These are not the moments of a cartoon villain. They are the memories that make his betrayal feel like the loss of a father, a mentor, a dream. And there is another fear, quieter but sharper, the fear of becoming Dutch. Beginning with idealistic intentions, cutting one corner, then another, explaining each small betrayal as necessary, until one day a mirror shows a stranger. Dutch is a warning that the old ways were dying not only outside, in a modernizing America, but inside, in a man who could not accept his own limits. In the end, Dutch's breakdown is compelling because it is not only about madness, it is about the fragile line between the stories people tell themselves and the people they actually are. Between a philosophy of freedom and the reality of a lost soul standing on a cliff, surrounded by the ruins of his own making. In the end, Dutch's breakdown is compelling, because it is not only about madness, it is a story of ideals stretched past their breaking point, of dreams turning to delusions, of a man mistaking his own reflection for destiny. From its humble beginnings in backroom card games and small-time robberies, the Van der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of a question that haunts the entire narrative. How far can a philosophy of freedom bend before it snaps into tyranny? From the very beginning, Dutch speaks of family, loyalty, and resistance to a corrupt civilization, and for a time those words mean something. He spares hostages on the Cornwall train, rails against industry around the campfire, and writes about a better world in Arthur's journal. Yet frame by frame, after Blackwater, those same words curdle. Each "I have a plan" carries less hope and more desperation, until the man who once promised safety to his people leaves John on the rooftop and lets Arthur bleed in the mud. This makes Dutch more than a single outlaw gone wrong. It makes him a mirror. His arc echoes leaders in the real world who begin with idealistic causes and end up protecting only their own power. Communities that cling to myths long after those myths have started to devour their children. How many movements start in the name of freedom and end with someone standing above the others, demanding faith instead of earning trust? Yet even in this collapse, the story refuses to be purely nihilistic. Arthur's final ride, turning away from Dutch's delusions to save John, is in the truest sense an act of reclamation. John and Abigail's attempt to build a ranch, to trade gun smoke for fence posts and school books, suggests that the old ways were dying, but something gentler could grow in their place. Small gestures linger, Charles staying behind to bury the dead, Sadie risking her life for Jack, a quiet thank you in a world that has almost forgotten the word. Revisiting Dutch's journey with this in mind transforms familiar scenes. The glassy stare before he executes Angela Bronte, the way his shoulders tense when Colm O'Driscoll taunts him, the subtle shift in Arthur's handwriting as doubt creeps in. Each tiny animation, each throwaway line, becomes another crack in the mask. Watching carefully, the descent unfolds almost frame by frame, not as a sudden fall, but as a long, slow slide no one manages to stop. This breakdown, and the fragile hope that grows in its shadow, is only one chapter in the larger story of this world and its fading frontier. The gang's tale stretches beyond Dutch's final step off that cliff, into new lands, new compromises, new forms of betrayal. Because if one legend can fracture this completely, what does that say about the others still standing, waiting for their turn under the light? That is the promise of this series, that every legend in this world will stand under that same unforgiving light. The Van der Linde gang is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom preached in campfire speeches and buried under blood in the mud of a dying frontier. From its humble beginnings in backroom scams and ragged campfires to that final standoff on the cliffs above the river, Dutch's journey is not just one man's collapse, but the living embodiment of a changing civilization. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and an idealistic outlaw who once spoke of justice and family became a man who could walk away from Arthur on that ridge, and from John on that fort wall. So the question lingers, when did he truly break? Was it Blackwater, Hosea's death, Micah's whispering poison, or was the fracture there from the very beginning, hidden beneath the charm and the philosophy? Those who have ridden through this entire descent now hold their own answer. Some will point to Blackwater and the unseen ferry job that shattered Dutch's illusion of control. Others will return to the execution of Angelo Bronte, or the moment he leaves Arthur to die in the dust, and say that is where the mask finally slipped. And some will argue that Dutch was never a hero in the truest sense at all, only a gifted storyteller selling a dream of freedom to every lost soul desperate enough to believe him. This is only one chapter in a larger tapestry. The next could follow Arthur's journal, page by page, as a full narrative, a man slowly waking up, sketching the death of his own family in ink and regret. Or it could track John's transformation between games, from reluctant follower to hardened father, standing over Dutch on that cliff with the weight of two eras on his shoulders. Perhaps the most revealing path of all would be a deep dive into Micah and Hosea, Dutch's devil and angel, arguing over his soul in every plan, every hesitation, every gunshot he orders, and every mercy he withholds. Which path should be taken next? Until that choice is made, the story already told can be seen anew. Familiar missions become different when each frame is read as another crack in Dutch's mind. The early restraint on the Cornwall train, the tightening jaw in St. Denis, the glassy stare in Beaver Hollow as he condemns the gang to one last doomstand. Revisited with this psychological lens, these scenes reveal not a sudden fall, but a careful, cruel unraveling. In the end, the image returns to Dutch on the cliff, coat snapping in the wind, eyes on a horizon that no longer exists. An outlaw who dreamed of remaking the world steps backward into the void, and the screen fades to black. Because every legend, no matter how grand, is built one fragile human moment at a time.